Section 11 of Salt Mines and Castles by Thomas Carr Howe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by T.R. Love of Pleasant Hill, California. Luther's Castle, Schloss Neuschwanstein. A telephone call from Brigade Headquarters changed our plans. It was Major Luther Miller of G2. He had just made an inspection of a house belonging to one of Goering's henchmen, and there was a lot of art stuff in it. He had reported the find to 3rd Army headquarters, and Captain Posey had told him to get in touch with me. Could I go up to the house with him that afternoon? Major Miller picked me up after lunch. He was a handsome fellow, tall and sparely built. He had an easy, pleasant manner. As we drove along, he gave me further details about the house to which we were going. It had been occupied until the day before by Fritz Gernert and his wife. Gernert had been the social secretary and close confidant of Goering. The Gernerts had been living on the 2nd and 3rd floors. They shared the house with a man named Ungerer, who had the 1st floor. Both Gernert and Ungerer had been apprehended and were now in jail. Major Miller had found a suspiciously large number of tapestries and other art objects on the premises. He thought they might be loot. The house was an unpretentious villa hidden among pine trees high up in the hills above town. The place was under guard. On the ground floor we examined the contents of a small storeroom. There were several cases bearing Ungerer's name and 3 or 4 large crates containing Italian furniture. A similar storeroom on the 2nd floor contained a dozen tapestries, a pile of Oriental rugs, a large collection of church vestments, and nearly 100 rare textiles mounted on cardboard. I noticed that the tapestries, vestments, and textiles were individually tagged and that the markings were in French. Concealed beneath the tapestries were 10 cases, each one about 2 feet square and a foot high. Major Miller hadn't seen these before. On each one was stenciled in Gothic letters, Reich Marshal Hermann Goering. They contained a magnificent collection of Oriental weapons. In a room which Gernert had apparently used for a study, we found 6 handsome leather portfolios filled with old master drawings. The drawings were by Dutch and French artists of the 17th and 18th centuries. There was a possibility that all of these things, with the exception of the weapon collection, which Goering had probably entrusted to Gernert, were the legitimate property of the tenants. It was equally possible that they had been illegally acquired. In the circumstances, Major Miller wished me to take charge of them. I said that I could take them to the central collecting point at Munich, where they would be held in safekeeping until ownership had been determined. The house had been thoroughly ransacked. Drawers had been pulled out and their contents disarranged. Closet doors stood open, and the clothing on hangers had been gone over. The beds were rumpled, for even the mattresses had been searched. Despite the topsy-turvy look of things, there was no evidence of wanton destruction. The search had been thorough and methodical. I asked the major what his men had been looking for, but his answer was non-committal. He did say, though, that the discovery of documents hidden in a false partition in the living room had prompted the search. The following morning, Steve, Lamont, and I went to the Gernert house in the command car. It would have been difficult to take a large truck up the narrow, winding road. In any case, I thought we could probably load all of the stuff in the command car. Major Miller had sent one of his officers ahead with the key. The house had been searched again. This time it looked as though a cyclone had struck it. Pillows had been ripped open, drawers had been emptied on the floor, clothes were scattered all over the bedrooms. I was relieved to find that the things which we had come to take away had not been tampered with. I asked the lieutenant with the key what had been going on in the house, and he muttered something about those CIC boys. I seemed to have touched on a sore subject, so I didn't pursue the matter. Lamont, who knew the ways of the army far better than I, said that probably there had been a jurisdictional dispute over who had the right to search the place, and that perhaps 2 different outfits had taken a crack at it. I was glad that Major Miller's emissary was there to bear witness to our behavior. We bundled up the rugs, tapestries, and textiles and got out as quickly as possible. They completely filled the command car. Lamont and Steve sat in front with the driver. I wedged myself between the top of the pile and the canvas top of the car. There was no room for the 10 cases of weapons, so I sent a message to Major Miller to have one of his men deliver them to us later in the day. When we got back to the rest house, Cress had dismantled his darkroom, and after lunch we loaded the photographic equipment onto one truck we had held over for that purpose. There was ample space for the things from the Gernert house. Before packing them, we had to make a complete list of the items. There were 213 church vestments, 81 mounted textiles, 20 rugs, and 11 tapestries. It was supper time when we finished. As the 10 cases of weapons hadn't arrived, we decided to wait till morning to load everything at once. That evening, Major Anderson of the 101st Airborne came over with the official receipt, which I was to sign. It was an elaborate document comprising Sergeant Peck's 70-page inventory and a covering letter from the CO of the 101st Airborne Division to the Commanding General of the Third Army, stating that I had received from Major Anderson the entire Goering collection for delivery to the central collecting point at Munich. Having discharged his responsibility, the Major was free to go home to the USA. That called for a celebration, and he had brought a bottle of cognac. It was 60 years old. He said that it came from Hitler's private stock at the Berghof. Even Steve, who had harbored a slight grudge toward Anderson since the night of our arrival at Berchtesgaden, relented, and the 4 of us toasted the successful evacuation of the Goering treasures. The Major had another surprise for us. He had engaged a room at Berchtesgadener Hof. He insisted that the 3 of us move over from the rest house. The next day was Sunday. What would be the point of going up to Munich? We had been working hard for 2 weeks. Why not take life easy for a day or 2? The Berchtesgadener Hof was a luxurious resort hotel. Its appointments were modern and lavish. In the days of the Nazi regime, it had been patronized by all visiting dignitaries, save the chosen few who had been invited to stay at the Berghof or the small hotel at Obersalzberg. It was now being used by the Army as a leave hotel. We had an enormous double room with twin beds and a couch. We had our own private terrace. The room faced south with a wonderful view of the mountains. We even had a telephone which worked. I hadn't seen such magnificence since the Royal Monsieur in Paris. There was a room for our driver on the top floor. The final deluxe touch was the schedule of meal hours. Breakfast wasn't even served until 8:30. It was hard to believe that we were in Germany. We were awakened early by a call from Major Miller. He had another job for me, 2, in fact. They had been interrogating Gernert, and he had told them that several pieces of valuable sculpture had been buried in the grounds of his house. The Major had located the spot, and the things were to be excavated before noon. Also, he wanted me to go with him to inspect a cache of pictures reported hidden in a forester's house not far from Berchtesgaden. I said I'd be ready in an hour. The phone rang again. This time it was Captain Posey. Had we remembered to pick up the pictures at St. Agatha, the ones Mussolini had given to Hitler? No, we hadn't. We were to be sure to attend to that before we returned to Munich. Steve was cursing these early callers, and Lamont was shaking his head sadly. Our life of ease was getting off to a hell of a poor start. When Major Miller and I reached the Gernert place, The sergeant of the guard and one of his men were standing beside a hole in the ground some 20 yards behind the house. The hole was about 6 feet square and 4 feet deep. 4 bundles wrapped in discolored newspaper lay on the ground at the edge of the excavation. The first bundle I opened contained a wood statue of the Madonna and Child, about 18 inches high. It had been an attractive example of the 15th century French school, but moisture had seriously damaged the original polychromy, and the wood beneath was soft and pulpy. The next 2 bundles contained pieces of similar workmanship, but they were not polychromed. One was a Madonna and Child, the other a figure of St. Barbara. Although they were damp, the wood had not disintegrated. The 4th package contained the prize of the lot, an ivory figure of the Madonna and Child. It was a fine piece from the hand of a French sculptor of the late 14th century. The ivory was discolored, but otherwise in good condition. I wrapped the statues in fresh paper and put them in the car. Our next objective was the little village of Hintersee, a few kilometers west of Berchtesgaden. The forester's house, a large chalet with overhanging eaves, stood at the edge of a meadow several hundred yards from the road. I explained the purpose of our visit to the young woman in peasant dress who answered our knock. She took us to a room on the 2nd floor, which was filled with unframed canvases stacked in neat rows along the walls. They were the work of contemporary German painters, and according to the young woman, had been the property of the local Nazi organization. From my point of view, the trip had been a waste of time. There wasn't a looted picture in the lot. While I looked at the paintings, Major Miller thumbed through a pile of books on a big table in one corner of the room. Among them he found a volume called Die Polnische Grausamkeit, The Polish Atrocity, a characteristic sample of German propaganda. It was a compilation of horror photographs illustrating the alleged inhuman treatment of Germans by the Poles. It added a gruesome touch to our visit. When I got back to the hotel at noon, I found messages from Steve and Lamont. Steve had gone over to Unterstein to see about the repairs on his steer truck, the one he and Kress had spent so much time on, fitting it up as a mobile photographic unit. There was also some work to be done on the Mercedes-Benz, which had been standing idle, concealed behind a clump of bushes by the rest house during our evacuation of the Goering collection. Steve had been right about the car. Colonel Davitt at Alt-Assi had not pressed his claim to it. Lamont had taken off for St. Agatha in a truck borrowed from brigade headquarters to pick up the Hitler-Mussolini pictures. There was also a message brought down by courier from Captain Posey's office. It contained a list of 3 places in the vicinity of Berchtesgaden which should be expected on the chance that they contained items from the Goering collection. One of them was the forester's hut at Hintersee, which I had just seen. The other 2 were castles in the neighborhood, Schloss Stauffeneck-Tirac and Schloss Marzol. I asked Major Anderson at lunch what he knew about them. He had nothing to contribute on the subject and said I'd probably draw a blank on all 3. After removing the Goering things from the train, he had taken the precaution of publishing a notice to all residents of the area, instructing them to declare all artworks in their possession. He had done this as a means of recovering objects which might have been sequestered by Goering's agents, and objects which might have been surreptitiously removed from the train while it stood on the siding. The results had been disappointing. Only about 30 pictures had been turned in, and none of them was in any way connected with Goering. The Major's prediction was correct. Lamont, Steve, and I visited the 2 castles the next day. In addition to their furnishings, Schloss Stauffeneck-Tirac and Schloss Marzol contained only books from the University of Munich. These fruitless researches took all day. It was after 5 when we left Berchtesgaden. It was raining when we reached Munich 3 hours later. Kress had no place to stay, and it took us an hour to locate a civilian agency which provided billets for transients. The only thing they had to offer was a room for one night in a ruined nunnery on the Matildastrasse. It was a gloomy place. There was no light, and the windows were without glass. One of the sisters, candle in hand, led us along a dark corridor to a small single room at the back. We followed with our flashlights. We gave Kress a box of K-rations and told him we'd come back for him in the morning. Steve was of two minds about the place. On the one hand, it wasn't good enough for Kress. On the other, he was impressed by the compassion of the sisters in offering refuge to strangers. He wanted me to point out to Kress the anomaly of his being given sanctuary by the church. I convinced him that my German wasn't fluent enough. We thanked the sister and went off to find ourselves a billet. We decided on the Excelsior, a hotel for transient officers. We were several miles from Third Army headquarters, whereas the hotel was only a few blocks away. I didn't like driving the Mercedes-Benz around Munich, even though I had got away with it so far. The Third Army regulation forbidding officers to drive was strictly enforced. Perhaps my uniform baffled the MPs. It consisted of a navy cap with blue cover, a British battle jacket with navy shoulder boards, khaki trousers, and black riding boots. It was my personal opinion that the MPs mistook the shoulder bars for the insignia of a Polish officer. The Poles and the other liaison officers as well were allowed to drive their own cars. Steve used to pooh-pooh my apprehensions about the MPs. "They're a bunch of dumbheads," he would say. "I ought to know. I used to be one." All the same, he didn't do much daytime driving around town. Captain Posey had our next job lined up for us. We were to evacuate the records of the Einsatzstab Rosenberg, the German art-looting organization, from Neuschwanstein Castle. The job would include the removal of part of the stolen art treasures also. The captain told us that the castle contained a great quantity of uncrated objects, mostly gold and silver. They presented a serious security problem, and it wasn't safe to leave them there indefinitely. Even though the French were anxious to get everything back from Neuschwanstein, for the present they would have to be content with the gold and the silver objects and as many of the smaller cases as we could handle. It would be more practicable to ship the larger things, furniture, sculpture, and pictures, direct to France by rail. This possibility was being investigated. It would save moving the things twice, first from Neuschwanstein to Munich, and then from Munich to Paris. But the records were badly needed at the collecting point in connection with the identification of the plunder stored there. So we were to concentrate on them and on the objects of great intrinsic value. It was going to take 3 or 4 days to line up the trucks necessary for this operation. There was a critical shortage of transportation at the moment because all available vehicles were being used to haul firewood. This was popularly known as Patton's pet project. For some weeks it had been first priority after foodstuffs. We welcomed the delay, for it gave us time to make a trip to Frankfurt. All 3 of us had urgent business to attend to there. Lamont's and Steve's records had to be straightened out. Both of them had been working in the field for so long that the headquarters to which they were technically assigned had lost track of them. And I wanted to find out what had happened to the personal belongings I had left in Frankfurt months ago. When I left, I had expected to be gone 10 days. In the back of our minds, too, lurked the hope of becoming incorporated as a special evacuation team. That's what we were, in fact, but we wanted to be recognized as such in name. The 3 of us worked well together and did not want to be separated. The decision would rest with Major Lafarge and Lieutenant Kuhn. We wheedled a command car out of the sergeant at the motor pool and took off late in the afternoon. Lamont, Steve, and I rode in the Mercedes-Benz, the command car following. I had little confidence in our rakish convertible. The car had been behaving well enough mechanically, but the tires were paper-thin. They were an odd size, and we had not been able to get any replacements. It was reassuring to know that the sturdy command car was trailing along behind. We arrived at in time for supper. Long before we reached the city, we could see the soaring single spire of the cathedral silhouetted against the sky. There was literally nothing left of the old city. All medieval houses, which, with the cathedral, had made it one of the most picturesque cities in Germany, lay in ruins, but the cathedral was undamaged. We stopped for gas just outside To our surprise, the army attendant filled our tank. This was 7th Army territory. In 3rd Army area, the maximum was 5 gallons. I mentioned this to the attendant. He said, "There's no gas shortage here. General Patton must be building up one hell of a big stockpile." We spent the night in Stuttgart. As the main transient hotel was full, we were assigned rooms at a small inn on the outskirts of the battered city. It took us an hour to find the place, so it was past midnight when we turned in. The next morning, we detoured a few kilometers in order to visit the castle at Ludwigsburg. The little town was laid out in the French manner, and its atmosphere was that of a miniature Versailles. The caretaker told us that the kings of Württemberg had lived at the castle until 1918. Our visit to it was the one pleasant experience of the day, which happened to be my birthday. We had our first flat tire in the castle courtyard, a second 1 hour later, and a third between Mannheim and Darmstadt. It was Sunday, and we had a devilish time finding places where we could get the inner tubes repaired. It was 10 p.m. when we pulled into Frankfurt. The trip from Stuttgart had taken 11 hours instead of the usual 4. We had spent 7 hours on tire repairs. My old room with the pink brocaded furniture was vacant, so I moved in for the night. In my absence, it had been successively occupied by 3 lieutenant colonels. All of my belongings had been boxed and stored away in the closet. Lamont and Steve put up at the house next door. We called on Bansel Lafarge and Charlie Kuhn at U.S. FET headquarters the next morning. We were lucky to find them together. Their office at that time was a kind of house divided against itself. Thanks to the organizational whim of a colonel, Bansel and Charlie had to spend part of the day in the office at the big Farben building where we found them, and part at their office in Höchst. Höchst was about 6 miles away. The remnant of the U.S. Group Control Council, which had not yet moved up to Berlin, was located there, in another vast complex of IG Farben buildings. It was an exhausting arrangement. Bansel and Charlie looked tired and worried, too. They seemed glad to see us, but they were preoccupied and upset about something. Presently, Charlie showed us a document which had just reached his desk a few days earlier. It was unsigned and undated. It bore the letterhead, Headquarters U.S. Group Control Council. The subject was Art Objects in the U.S. Zone. Open footnote. See articles, German Paintings in the National Gallery, a Protest, by Charles L. Kuhn in College Art Journal, January 1946. This and subsequent references printed by permission. Close footnote. In the first paragraph, reference was made to the great number and value of the art objects stored in emergency repositories throughout the U.S. zone. Farther on, the art objects were divided into 3 classes according to ownership. Those in Class C were defined as works of art placed in the U.S. zone by Germany for safekeeping, which are the bona fide property of the German nation. Concerning the disposition of the works of art thus described, the letter had this to say: It is not believed that the U.S. would desire the works of art in Class C to be made available for reparations and to be divided among a number of nations. Even if this is to be done, these works of art might well be returned to the U.S. to be inventoried and cared for by our leading museums. The next and last sentence contained this extraordinary proposal. They could be held in trusteeship for return many years from now to the German people if and when the German nation had earned the right to their return. Clipped to the document was a notation dated July 29, 1945, bearing the signature of the Chief of Staff of General Lucius D. Clay, Deputy Military Governor. It read, in part, General Clay states that this paper has been approved by the President for implementation after the close of the current Big Three Conference. We were dumbfounded. No wonder Bonsall and Charlie were worried. It had never occurred to any of us that German national art treasures would be removed to the United States. After speculating on the possible consequences attendant on the implementation of the document, we dropped the subject. Momentarily, there was nothing to do but wait and hope that the whole matter would be dropped. By comparison, our personal problems seemed insignificant, but Charlie and Bonsall heard us out. They approved our idea of remaining together as a team working out of USFET. I was already permanently assigned to USFET, and there were 2 vacancies on their TO, Table of Organization, to which Lamont and Steve could be appointed. The necessary paperwork took up most of the day and involved a trip to ECAD headquarters at Bad Homburg. At 5 o'clock, we had our new orders. Steve suggested that we drive up to Marburg and see Captain Hancock, the monuments officer in charge of the 2 great art repositories which had been established there. They were the prototype of the central collecting point at Munich. However, they differed in an important respect from the one at Munich. They contained practically no loot. Virtually everything in them belonged to German museums and had been recovered by our monuments officers from the mines in which the Germans had placed them for safekeeping during the war. Marburg, some 50 miles north of Frankfurt, lay in the Regierungsbezirk, or government district, of Kassel, which was in turn a subdivision of the province of Hesse. It was a 2-hour drive, but we stopped en route for supper with a quartermaster outfit at Gießen, so it was nearly 8 o'clock when we arrived. We found Walker Hancock in his office in the Staatsarchiv building. He was a man in the middle 40s and of medium height. His face broke into a smile, and his fine dark eyes lighted up with an expression of genuine pleasure at the sight of Lamont and Steve. This was the first time they had seen one another since the close of the war, when they had been working together in Weimar. I had never met Walker Hancock, but I had heard more about him than about any other American monuments officer. I knew that he had had a distinguished career as a sculptor before the war, and that he had been the first of our monuments officers to reach France. He had been attached to the First Army until the end of hostilities. Lamont was devoted to Walker, and Steve's regard for him bordered on worship. While the 3 of them reminisced, I found myself responding to his warmth and sincerity. He wouldn't hear of our returning to Frankfurt that night. He wanted to show us the things in his 2 depots, and we wouldn't be able to see more than a fraction of them before morning. The few that we did see whetted our appetite for more. In the galleries on the 2nd floor, we saw some of the finest pictures from the museums of the Rhineland. There were 3 wonderful Van Goghs. One was a portrait of Armand Rollin, the young man with a mustache and slouch hat. It belonged to the Folkwang Museum at Essen. Color reproductions of this portrait had, in recent years, rivaled those of Whistler's mother in popularity. Walker said that it had been covered with mold when he found it in the Seigen mine, with the rest of the Essen pictures. His assistant, Sheldon Keck, formerly the restorer of the Brooklyn Museum, had successfully removed the mold before it had done any serious damage. The second Van Gogh was the famous large still life entitled White Roses. The third was a brilliant late landscape. There were other magnificent 19th century canvases, the bewitching portrait of Monsieur and Madame Sisley by Renoir, a full-length Manet, and a great Daumier. Walker climaxed the display with the celebrated Rembrandt self-portrait from the Weyrauch-Richartz Museum of Cologne. This was the last and most famous of the portraits the artist painted of himself. We spent the night at the Gasthaus Sohn, a 17th century inn facing the old marketplace. The proprietor reluctantly assigned us 2 rooms on the second floor. They were normally reserved for the top brass. Judging from the austerity of the furnishings and the simplicity of the plumbing, I thought it unlikely that we would be routed from our beds by any late-arriving generals. Walker met us for breakfast the next morning with word that the war with Japan had ended. Announcements in German had already been posted in several of the shop windows. Though thrilling to us, the news seemed to make very little impression on the citizens of the sleepy university town. The people in the streets were as unsmiling as ever. If anything, some of them looked a little grimmer than usual. We drove to the Staatsarchiv building with Walker. He took us to a room containing a fabulous collection of medieval art objects. There were crosses and crosiers, coffers and chalices, wrought in precious metals and studded with jewels, masterpieces of the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries. The most arresting individual piece was the Golden Madonna, an archaic seated figure 2 feet high, dated from the 10th century. These marvelous relics of the Middle Ages belonged to the Cathedral of Metz. It was one of the greatest collections of its kind in the entire world. Its intrinsic value was enormous, its historic value incalculable. Walker said that arrangements were being made for its early return to the cathedral. The French were planning an elaborate ceremony in honor of the event. It was a 5-minute drive to the other depot under Captain Hancock's direction. This was the Jubiläumsbau, or Jubilee Building, a handsome structure of pre-Nazi modern design. It was the headquarters of the Archaeological Institute, headed by Professor Richard Hammond, the internationally famous medieval scholar. It also housed the archives of Photo Marburg, the stupendous library of art photographs founded and directed by the professor. Walker was putting the resources of Photo Marburg to good use, compiling a complete photographic record of the objects in his care. Among the treasures stored in the Jubiläumsbau were some of the choicest masterpieces from the Berlin State Museums. Perhaps the most famous were the twin canvases by Watteau entitled Gerson's Signboard. Regarded by many as the supreme work of the greatest painter of the French Rococo period, the 2 pictures had been the prized possessions of Frederick the Great. Painted to hang side by side, forming a continuous composition, they represented the shop of Monsieur Gerson, dealer in works of art. It is said that the paintings were finished in 8 days. They were painted in the year 1732, when the artist was at the height of his career. I was told that, during the early years of the war, Goering made overtures to the Louvre for one of its finest Watteaus. According to the story, the negotiations ended abruptly when the museum signified its willingness to part with the painting in exchange for Gerson's signboard. The brilliant French school of the 18th century was further represented at the Jubiläumsbau by a superb Boucher, the subject, Mercury on Venus, and 2 exquisite Chardins, the cook, one of his most enchanting scenes of everyday life, and the portrait of a lady sealing a letter, an unusually large composition for this unpretentious painter whose canvases are today worth a king's ransom. There were masterpieces of the German school. The great series of Cranachs which had belonged to the Hohenzollerns filled one entire room. Excellent examples of Rubens and Van Dyck represented the Flemish school, Ruysdael and Van Goyen the Dutch. The high quality of every picture attested to the taste and connoisseurship of German collectors. Walker said that he hoped to arrange a public exhibition of the pictures. Marburg had been neglected by our bombers. Only 1 or 2 bombs had fallen in the city, and the resulting damage had been slight. Concussion had blasted the windows of the Staatsarchiv, but the Jubiläumsbau was untouched. Perhaps he would put on a series of small exhibitions, say 50 pictures at a time. The members of his local German committee were enthusiastic about the project. It would be an important first step in the rehabilitation of German cultural institutions, which was an avowed part of the American Fine Arts program. Thanks to the hesitancy of an officer at higher headquarters who was exasperatingly security conscious, Walker did not realize his ambition until 3 months later, on the eve of his departure for the United States. We celebrated VJ Day on our return to Frankfurt that evening. The big casino behind U.S. FET headquarters was the scene of the principal festivities. Drinks were on the house until the bar closed at 10. It was a warm summer night, and the broad terrace over the main entrance was crowded. An army band blared noisily inside. Civilian attendants skulked in the background, avidly collecting cigarette butts from the ashtrays and the terrace floor. They reaped a rich harvest that night. The Mercedes-Benz presented a problem. Its status was a dubious one. Since it was still registered with an MG detachment in Austria, I felt uncomfortable about driving it around Germany. At Charlie Kuhn's suggestion, we filed a request with the naval headquarters in Frankfurt for assignment of the vehicle to our special evacuation team. The request was couched in impressive legal language which Charlie thought would do the trick. Armed with a copy of this request, I felt confident that we would not be molested by inquisitive MPs on our trip back to Munich. We didn't get started until late afternoon, having wasted 2 hours dickering with the transportation officer at Frankfurt MG Detachment for a spare tire. We returned by way of Würzburg and Nürnberg. It was dark when we reached Nürnberg, but the light of the full moon was sufficient to reveal the ruined walls and towers of the old inner city. As we struck south of the city to the Autobahn, we could see the outlines of the vast unfinished stadium designed to seat 140,000 people. We had to proceed cautiously since many of the bridges had been destroyed and detours were frequent. As a result, it was midnight when we reached Munich. The transient hotel was full, so we had to be content with makeshift quarters at the central collecting point. In our absence, the transportation situation had eased up a little. Captain Posey told us the next morning that 6 trucks would be available in the early afternoon. We decided to keep the command car for the trip to Neuschwanstein and leave the Mercedes-Benz in Munich to be painted. In anticipation of registration papers from the Navy, we thought it would be appropriate to have the car painted battleship gray and stenciled with letters reading U.S. Navy. One of the mechanics in the garage at the central collecting point agreed to do this for us in exchange for a bottle of rum and a half bottle of scotch. Officers at 3rd Army Headquarters had bar privileges plus a liquor ration, but the enlisted men didn't fare so well. Our base of operations for the evacuation of the castle of Neuschwanstein was the picturesque little town of Füssen, some 80 miles south of Munich in the heart of the Swan country. This region of southern Bavaria, celebrated for its association with the name of Richard Wagner, is one of the most beautiful in all Germany. The mountains rise sharply from the floor of the level green valley. The turreted castle, perched on top of one of the lower peaks at an elevation of 1,000 feet, is visible for miles. Built in the 1870s by Ludwig II, the Mad King of Bavaria, It was the most fantastic creation of that exotic monarch whose passion for building nearly bankrupted his kingdom. When we saw the castle rising majestically from its pine-covered mountaintop, we were struck by the incongruity of our 6-truck convoy lumbering through the romantic countryside. We presented our credentials to a swarthy major who was the commanding officer of the small MG detachment at Füssen. He arranged for our billets at the Alte Post, the hotel where officers of the detachment were quartered, and after we had deposited our gear in a room on the 4th floor, conducted us to the Schloss. The steep road to the lower courtyard of the castle wound for more than a mile up the side of the mountain. At the castle entrance, the major identified us to the guard, and our 6 trucks filed into the courtyard. In the upper courtyard, reached by a broad flight of stone steps, we found the caretaker who had the keys to the main section of the castle. He did not, however, have access to the wing in which the records of the Einsatzstab Rosenberg were stored. The only door to that part of the building had been locked and sealed by Lieutenant James Rovermer, the monuments officer of the 7th Army, when the castle had first fallen into American hands. We had brought the key with us from 3rd Army headquarters. Before examining those rooms, we made a tour of the 4 main floors of the castle. The hallways and vaulted kitchens on the 1st floor were filled to overflowing with enormous packing cases and uncrated furniture, all taken from French collections. 3 smaller storage rooms resembling the stock rooms of Tiffany's and a porcelain factory combined were jammed with gold and silver and rare china. Most of the loot had been concentrated on the 1st floor, but the unfinished rooms of the 2nd had been fitted with racks for the storage of paintings. In addition to the looted pictures, there were several galleries of stacked paintings from the museums of Munich. The living apartments on the 3rd floor, divested of their furnishings, were filled with stolen furniture. Louis Quinze chairs, table, and sofas, and ornate Italian cabinets lined the walls of rooms and corridors. They contrasted strangely with scenes from the Wagner operas, which King Ludwig had chosen as the theme for the mural decorations. Only the gold-walled throne room and, on the floor above, the lofty Festsaal were devoid of loot. We proceeded to the wing of the castle which contained the records. Having broken the seals and unlocked the door, we entered a hallway about 30 feet long. The doors opening onto this hallway were also locked and sealed. Behind them lay the offices of the Einsatzstab Rosenberg. They were crowded with bookshelves and filing cabinets. In one room stood a huge showcase filled with fragile Roman glass. The rooms of the 2nd floor were full of French furniture and dozens of small packing cases. These cases were made of carefully finished quarter-sawed oak. We had seen similar ones in the Goering collection. They had been the traveling cases for precious objects belonging to the Rothschilds. These, too, contained Rothschild treasures, exquisite bibelots of jade, agate, onyx, and jasper, and innumerable pieces of Oriental and European porcelain. At one end of the hallway were 2 rooms which had been used as a photographic laboratory. We had brought Kress with us. Steve went off to make arrangements to install his equipment, while Lamont and I calculated the number of men we would need for the evacuation work the next morning. We asked the major for 20, 2 shifts of 10. The Neuschwanstein operation lasted 8 days. We worked nights as well, because there were thousands of small objects, many of them fragile and extremely valuable, which we could not trust to the inexpert hands of our work party. There was no electricity in the small storage rooms, so we had to work by candlelight. It took us 1 evening to pack the Roman glass, and the 4 succeeding evenings, working till midnight, to pack the 2,000 pieces of gold and silver in the David Field collection. The Nazi looters had thoughtfully saved the well-made cases in which they had carted off this magnificent collection from Monsieur David Ville's house in Paris. There were candelabra, dishes, knives, forks, spoons, snuff-boxes, the rarest examples of the art of the French goldsmiths of the 17th and 18th centuries. This unique collection had created a sensation when it was exhibited in Paris a few years before the war. The fact that the incomparable assemblage would probably one day be left to the Louvre by the eminent connoisseur, who had spent a lifetime collecting it, had not deterred the Nazi robbers. He was a Jew. That justified its confiscation. Aside from the pleasure it gave me to handle the beautiful objects, I relished the idea of helping to recover the property of a fellow Californian. Monsieur David Ville had been born in San Francisco. The Nazis had been methodical as usual. Every piece was to have been systematically recatalogued while the collection was at Neuschwanstein. On some of the shelves we found slips of paper stating that this or that object had not yet been photographed. Noch nicht fotografiert. The tedious manual labor involved in packing small objects and the great distance which the packed cases had to be carried when ready for loading were the chief difficulties at Neuschwanstein. Not only did the cases have to be carried several hundred feet from the storage rooms to the door of the castle, but from the door to the trucks was a long trek down 2 flights of steps and across a wide courtyard. In this respect, the operation resembled the evacuation of the monastery at Hohenfurth. 3 months after our partial evacuation of the castle, a team composed of Captain Edward Adams, Lieutenant J.G. Charles Parkhurst, USNR, and Captain Hubert de Bry, a French officer, completed the removal of the loot. This gigantic undertaking required 8 weeks. If I remember the figures correctly, more than 12,000 objects were boxed and carted away. The cases were built in a carpenter's shop set up in the castle kitchens. 150 truckloads were delivered to the railroad siding at Füssen and thence transported to Paris. It was an extraordinary achievement carried out despite heavy snowfall. The only operation which rivaled it was the evacuation of the salt mines at Aussy. The last morning of our stay at Füssen, Lamont and I had a special mission to perform. A German art dealer named Gustav Röschlitz was living at Gübsmüller, a 5-minute drive from Hohenschwangau, the small village below the castle. For a number of years, Röschlitz had had a gallery in Paris. His dealings with the Nazis, in particular his trafficking in confiscated pictures, had been the subject of special investigations by Lieutenants Plaut and Rousseau, our OSS friends. They were the 2 American naval officers who were preparing an exhaustive report on the activities of the infamous Einsatztaube Rosenberg. They had interrogated Röschlitz and placed him under house arrest. In his possession were 22 modern French paintings, including works by Derain, Matisse, and Picasso, formerly belonging to well-known Jewish collections. He had obtained them from Goering and other leading Nazis in exchange for old master paintings. We were to relieve Herr Röschlitz of these canvases. At the farmhouse in which Röschlitz and his wife were living, the maid-of-all-work who answered our knock said that no one was at home. Herr Röschlitz would not be back before noon. Lamont and I returned to our jeep and started back across the fields to the highway. We had driven about 100 yards when we saw a heavy-set, sullen-faced man of about 50 walking toward us. "I'll bet that's Röschlitz," I said to Lamont. Stopping the car, I called out to him, "Herr Röschlitz?" After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. "Hop in. We want to have a talk with you," I said. We returned to the farmhouse and followed our truculent host up the stairs to his sitting room on the 2nd floor. There we were joined by his wife, a timid young woman who, like her husband, spoke fluent English. I said that we had come for the pictures. Rochlis made no protest. He brusquely directed his wife to bring them in. As she left the room, I thought it odd that he hadn't gone along to help her, but she returned almost immediately with the paintings in her arms. All 22 were rolled around a long mailing tube. Together they spread the canvases about the room, on the table, on the chairs, and on the floor. They were, without exception, works of excellent quality. One large, early Picasso, the portrait of a woman and child, was alone worth a small fortune. I was wondering what Rochlis had given in exchange for the lot when he began to explain how the pictures had come into his possession. He must have taken us for credulous fools, because the story he told made him out a victim of tragic circumstance. He said that Goering had made an offer on several of his pictures. Rochlis had accepted, but insisted on being paid in cash. Goering had agreed to the terms, and the pictures were delivered. Then, instead of paying in cash, Goering had forced him to accept these modern paintings. He had protested, but to no avail. Of course, these pictures were all right in their way, he said deprecatingly, but he was not a dealer in modern art. Naturally, he did not know that they had been confiscated. It was all a dreadful mistake. But what could he do? I said that I realized how badly he must have felt, and that I knew he would be relieved to learn that the pictures were now going back to their rightful owners. The pictures were carefully re-rolled, and we got up to leave. At the door, Rochlis told us that he had lost his entire stock. He had stored all of his paintings at Baden-Baden in the French zone. Did we think he would be able to recover them? We assured him that justice would be done, and, leaving him to interpret that remark as he saw fit, drove off with the 22 pictures. End of section 11. Section 12 of Salt Mines and Castles by Thomas Carr Howe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by T.R. Love of Pleasant Hill, California. Hidden Treasures at Nürnberg. On our return to Munich that evening, Craig told us that preparations were being made for the immediate restitution of several important masterpieces recovered in the American zone. General Eisenhower had approved a proposal to return at once to each of the countries overrun by the Germans at least one outstanding work of art. This was to be done in his name as a gesture of token restitution, symbolizing American policy with regard to ultimate restitution of all stolen art treasures to the rightful owner nations. It was felt that the gracious gesture on the part of the commanding general of the United States forces in Europe would serve to reaffirm our intentions to right the wrongs of Nazi oppression. In view of the vast amount of art which had thus far been recovered, it would be months before it could all be restored to the plundered countries. Meanwhile, these token restitutions would be an earnest of American goodwill. They would be sent back from Germany at the expense of the United States government. Thereafter, representatives of the various countries would be invited to come to our collecting points to select, assemble, and, in transportation of their own providing, remove those objects which the Germans had stolen. Belgium was to receive the first token restitution. The great Van Eyck altarpiece, the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb, was the obvious choice among the stolen Belgian treasures. The famous panels had been reposing in the central collecting point at Munich since we had removed them from the salt mine at Alt-Aussee. A special plane had been chartered to fly them to Brussels. The Belgian government had signified approval of air transportation. Direct rail communication between Munich and Brussels had not been resumed, and the highways were not in the best of condition. By truck, it would be a rough 2-day trip. By air, a matter of 3 hours. Bonsall Lafarge had already flown from Frankfurt to Brussels, where plans had been made for an appropriate ceremony on the arrival of the altarpiece. The American ambassador was to present the panels to the Prince Regent on behalf of General Eisenhower. It was to be an historic occasion. I went out to the airport to confirm the arrangements for the C-54. It was only a 15-minute drive from the Königsplatz to the field. I was also to check on the condition of the streets. They were in good shape all the way. The plane was to take off at noon. Lamont, Steve, and I supervised the loading of the 10 precious cases. We led off in a jeep. The truck followed with the panels. 4 of the civilian packers went along to load the cases onto the plane. Captain Posey was to escort the altarpiece to Brussels. When we got to the airport, we learned that the plane had not arrived. There would be a 2-hour delay. At the end of 2 hours, we were informed that there was bad weather south of Brussels. All flights had been canceled for the day. We drove back to the collecting point at the Königsplatz and had just finished unloading the panels when a message came from the field. The weather had cleared. The plane would be taking off in half an hour. I caught Captain Posey as he was leaving the building for his office at 3rd Army Headquarters. The cases were reloaded, and we were on our way to the field in 15 minutes. The truck was driven onto the field where the big C-54 stood waiting. In another quarter of an hour, the panels were aboard and lashed securely to metal supports in the foreport of the passenger compartment. Captain Posey, the only passenger, waved jauntily as the doors swung shut. Enviously, we watched the giant plane roll down the field, lift waveringly from the airstrip, and swing off to the northwest. The altarpiece was on the last lap of an extraordinary journey. We wished George Stout could have been in on this. The plane reached Brussels without mishap. The return of the great national treasure was celebrated throughout the country. Encouraged by the success of this first token restitution, Major Lafarge directed that a similar gesture be made to France. At the collecting point, Craig selected 71 masterpieces looted from French private collections. The group included Fragonard, Chardin, Lancret, Rubens, Van Dyck, Hals, and a large number of 17th-century Dutch masters. Only examples of the highest quality were chosen. Ham Coulter, the naval officer who worked with Craig at the bow, was the emissary appointed to accompany the paintings to Paris. It was decided to return them by truck, inasmuch as it would have been impracticable to attempt shipping uncrated pictures by air. The convoy consisted of 2 trucks, one for the pictures, the other for extra gasoline. It was a hard 2-day trip from Munich to Paris. Ham got through safely, but reported on his return that the roads had been extremely rough a good part of the way. He delivered the pictures in Paris to the Musée du Jeu de Paume, the little museum which the Germans had used during the occupation as a clearinghouse for their methodical plundering of the Jewish collections. His expedition had been marred by only one minor incident. When the paintings were being unloaded at the museum, one of the women attendants watching the operation noticed that some of the canvases were unframed. She had asked, "And where are the frames?" This was too much for Coulter. In perfect French, the courteous lieutenant told her precisely what she could do about the frames. Shortly after the return of the Ghent altarpiece, Captain Posey was demobilized. His duties as MFA&A officer at 3rd Army Headquarters in Munich were assumed by Captain Edwin Ray. I had not seen Ray since the early summer, when he and Lieutenant Edith Standen had been assigned to assist me in inventorying the collections of the Berlin museums in the vaults of the Reichsbank at Frankfurt. Edwin was a meticulous fellow, gentle but determined. Although by no means lacking in a sense of humor, he resented joking references to a fancied resemblance to Houdon's well-known portrait of Voltaire, and I didn't blame him. He took on his new responsibilities with quiet assurance and in a short time won the complete confidence of his superiors at Third Army Headquarters. Throughout his long tenure of office, he maintained an unruffled calm in the face of obstacles which would have exhausted a less patient man. He was responsible for all matters pertaining to the fine arts in the Eastern Military District of the American Zone, that is, Bavaria, an area more than twice the size of the two provinces, Greater Hesse and Württemberg-Baden, comprising the Western Military District of our zone. During the early days of Captain Ray's regime, Charlie Kuhn paid a brief visit to Munich. He had just completed the transfer of the Berlin Museum collections from Frankfurt to the Landesmuseum at Wiesbaden. The university buildings in Frankfurt, which I had requisitioned for a collecting point, had proved unsuitable. The repairs, he said, would have taken months. On the other hand, the Wiesbaden Museum, though damaged, was ideal for the purpose. Of course, there hadn't been a glass left in any of the windows, and the roof had had to be repaired. But thanks to the energy and ingenuity of Walter Farmer, the building had been rehabilitated in 2 months. Captain Farmer was the director of the new collecting point. When I asked where Farmer had got the glass, Charlie was evasive. All he would say was that Captain Farmer was wise in the ways of the Army. Charlie was headed for Vienna to confer with Lieutenant Colonel Ernest de Wald, chief of the MFA&A section at USFA headquarters, United States Forces, Austria. Colonel de Wald wanted to complete the evacuation of the mine at Alt-Assi, which was now under his jurisdiction. For this project, he hoped to obtain the services of the officers who had worked there when the mine had been Third Army's responsibility. Captain Ray was reluctant to lend the special evacuation team because there was still so much work to be done in Bavaria. But he agreed, provided that Charlie could sell the idea to the Chief of Staff at Third Army. This Charlie succeeded in doing, and departed for Vienna a day later. Steve was crazy to see Vienna. I think his parents had been born there, so Charlie took him along. After they had left, Captain Ray requested Lamont and me to make an inspection trip to northern Bavaria. Our first stop was Bamberg. There we examined the Neue Residenz, which Ray contemplated establishing as an auxiliary collecting point to house the contents of various repositories in Upper Franconia. Reports reaching his office indicated that storage conditions in that area were unsatisfactory. Either the repositories were not weatherproof or they were not being adequately guarded. It was also rumored that the UNRRA was planning to fill the Neue Residenz with DPs, displaced persons. Captain Ray was determined to put a stop to that because the building, a fine example of late 17th century architecture, was on the SHAEF list of protected monuments. This fact should have guaranteed its immunity from such a hazard. Even during combat, the SHAEF list had been a great protection to the monuments of historic and artistic importance. Now that no doctrine of military necessity could be invoked to justify improper use of the building, Ray did not propose to countenance its occupancy by DPs. The Neue Residenz contained dozens of empty, brocaded rooms, but no plumbing. We decided that it would do for a collecting point and agreed with Ray that the DPs should be housed elsewhere if possible. The officer from the local MG detachment, who was showing us around, confirmed the report that UNRRA intended to move in. He didn't think they would relinquish the building without a protest. The influx of refugees from the Russian zone had doubled the town's normal population of 60,000. It was a disappointment to find that the superb sculpture in the cathedral across the square was still bricked up. The shelters had proved a needless precaution, for Bamberg had not been bombed. Only the bridge over the Regnitz had been blown up, and the Germans had done that themselves. From Bamberg, we drove north to Coburg, where we had a twofold mission. First, we were to obtain specific information about 10 cases which contained a collection of art objects belonging to a prince of Hesse. The cases were said to be stored in Feste Coburg, the walled castle above the town. If they were the property of Philip of Hesse, then they would probably be taken into custody by the American authorities. We had been told that he was in prison. His art dealings during the past few years were being reviewed by the OSS officers charged with the special investigation of Nazi art looting activities. Philip was the son of the Landgrafen of Hesse. It was in the flower-filled Waffenraum of her castle near Frankfurt that I had seen the family tombs months before. If, on the other hand, the cases belonged to a different Prince of Hesse, one whose political record was clean, and storage conditions were satisfactory, we would simply leave them where they were for the time being. Our second objective was Schloss Tombeck, a few kilometers from Coburg. Paintings stolen by Frank, the Nazi governor of Poland, from the palace at Warsaw were stored there. Schloss Tombeck also contained pictures from the Stettin Museum. Stettin was now in the Russian zone of occupied Germany. On our arrival in Coburg, Lamont and I drove to the headquarters of the local MG detachment, which were located in the Palais Edinburgh. This unpretentious building was once the residence of Queen Victoria's son, the Duke of Edinburgh. There we arranged with Lieutenant Milton A. Pells, the monument officer of the Coburg detachment, to inspect the storage rooms at the castle. Pells was a big fellow who spoke German fluently. He welcomed us hospitably and took us up to the castle, where we met Dr. Grundmann, who had the keys to the storage room. This silent, sour-faced German was curator of the prince's collections. He said that his employer was Prince Ludwig of Hesse, a cousin of Philip. The cases contained paintings and objets d'art which had been in the possession of the family for years. Grundmann had personally removed them from Ludwig's estate in Silesia the day before the Russians occupied the area. Ludwig's most important treasure was the world-famous painting by Holbein, known as the Madonna Bürgermeister Meyer. Painted in 1526, it had hung for years in the palace at Darmstadt. The Dresden Gallery owned a 17th-century replica. Early in the war, Prince Ludwig had sent the original to his Silesian castle for safekeeping. Grundmann had brought it back to Bavaria along with the 10 cases now at Coburg. From Coburg, he had taken the Holbein to Schloss Bonz, a castle not far from Bamberg. He said that the prince was living at Wolfsgarten, a small country place near Darmstadt. Ludwig was eager to regain possession of the painting. Did we think that could be arranged? We told him he would have to obtain an authorization from Captain Ray at Munich. Schloss Tombeck was a 10-minute drive from Coburg. This great country house, built around 3 sides of a courtyard, belonged to the Countess of Ortenburg. She occupied the center section. A detachment of troops was billeted in one wing. The other was filled with the Stettin and Warsaw pictures. There were over 200 from the Stettin Museum. 19th-century German paintings predominated, but I noticed 2 fine Hals portraits and a Van Gogh landscape among them. The civilian custodian, answerable to the MG authorities at Coburg, was Dr. Wilhelm Egebrecht. He had been curator of the Stettin Museum until thrown out by the Nazis because his wife was 1/4 Jewish. He was a mousy little fellow with a bald head and gold-rimmed spectacles. He asked apprehensively if we intended to send the paintings back to Russian-held Stettin. We said that we had come only to check on the physical security of the present storage place. So far as we knew, the paintings would remain where they were for the present. This inconclusive piece of information seemed to reassure him. The paintings looted from Warsaw were the pièces de résistance of the treasures at Schloss, especially the 9 great canvases by Bilato, the 18th century Venetian master. Governor Frank had ruthlessly removed the pictures from their stretchers and rolled them up for shipment. As a result of this rough handling, the paint had flaked off in places, but the damage was not serious. When we examined the pictures, they were spread out on the floor. They filled 2 rooms, 40 feet square. Later, they were taken to the Munich collecting point and mounted on new stretchers in preparation for their return to Warsaw. When we got back to Munich, Steve had returned from Vienna. He had news for us. Charlie Kuhn had already left for Frankfurt. Colonel de Walde was coming to Munich in a few days to talk to Colonel Roy Dolfers, Ray's chief of staff at Third Army, about reopening the Altaussee mine. Either Charlie or Bensel would come down from USFET headquarters when de Walde arrived. A new man had joined the MFA&A section at USFA, Andrew Ritchie, director of the Buffalo Museum. He had come over as a civilian. Steve thought that Ritchie would be the USFA representative at Munich. There was a lot of stuff at the collecting point which would eventually go back to Austria. It would have to be checked with the records there. That would be Ritchie's job. Steve told us that Lincoln Kirsten had gone home. His mother was seriously ill, and Lincoln had left on emergency orders. The 3 of us went to Captain Ray's office. Lamont and I had to make a report on our trip to Coburg. Ray had a new assignment for us. He had just received orders from USFET headquarters to prepare the Krakow altarpiece for shipment. It was to be sent back to Poland as a token restitution. This was the colossal carved altarpiece by Wiat Stoss, which the Nazis had stolen from the Church of St. Mary at Krakow. Wiat Stoss had been commissioned by the King of Poland in 1477 to carve the great work. It had taken him 10 years. After the invasion of Poland in 1939, the Nazis had carted it off, lock, stock, and barrel, to Nuremberg. They contended that since Wiat Stoss had been a native of Nuremberg, it belonged in the city of his birth. The missing altarpiece was the first of her looted treasures for which Poland had registered a claim with the American authorities at the close of the war. After months of diligent investigation, it was found by American officers in an underground bunker across the street from the Albrecht Dürer house in Nuremberg. In addition to the dismantled figures of the central panel, painted and gilded figures of hollow wood 10 feet high, the 12 ornate side panels, together with the statues and pinnacles surmounting the framework, had been crowded into the bunker. The same bunker contained another priceless looted treasure, the coronation regalia of the Holy Roman Empire. Among these venerable objects were the jeweled crown of the Emperor Conrad, commonly known as the Crown of Charlemagne, dating from the 11th century, a shield, 2 swords, and the orb. Since 1804, they had been preserved in the Schatzkammer, the imperial treasure room at Vienna. In 1938, the Nazis removed them to Nuremberg, basing their claim to possession on a 15th century decree of the Emperor Sigismund that they were to be kept in that city. On the eve of the German collapse, 2 high officials of the city had spirited away these 5 pieces. The credit for recovering the treasures goes to an American officer of German birth, Lieutenant Walter Horn, professor of art at the University of California. The 2 officials at first disclaimed any knowledge of their whereabouts. After hours of relentless grilling by Lieutenant Horn, the men finally admitted their guilt. They were promptly tried, heavily fined, and sent to prison. 3 months later, at the request of the Austrian government, the imperial treasures were flown back to Vienna. This historic shipment contained other relics which the Nazis had taken from Schatzkammer, relics of the greatest religious significance. They included an alleged fragment of the True Cross, a section of the tablecloth said to have been used at the Last Supper, a lance venerated as the one which had touched the wounds of Christ, and links from the chains traditionally believed to have bound St. Peter, St. Paul, and St. John. On Captain Ray's instructions, Steve and I went to Nuremberg to pack the Schloss altarpiece. At that time, the coronation regalia was still in the bunker, where, on the afternoon of our arrival, we had an opportunity to examine it. We found that the heavy framework which supported the altar panels was not stored in the bunker. Because of its size, the upright pieces were 30 feet high. It had been taken to Schloss Wiesenthau, an old castle outside Forchheim, 30 miles away. Leaving Steve to start packing the smaller figures and pinnacles, I got hold of a semi-trailer, the only vehicle long enough to accommodate a load of such length. It was an hour's drive to the castle. With a crew of 20 PWs, I finished loading the framework in 2 hours and returned to Nuremberg in time for supper. That evening, Steve and I figured out the number of trucks we would need for the altarpiece. Lamont had remained in Munich to make tentative arrangements, pending word from us. He was going to ask for 10 trucks, and we came to the conclusion that this would be about the right number, in addition, of course, to the semi-trailer for the supporting framework. We got out our maps and studied our probable route to Krakow. One road would take us through Dresden and Breslau, another by way of Pilsen and Prague. Perhaps we could go one way and return the other. In either case, we would have to pass through Russian-occupied territory. It would probably take some time to obtain the necessary clearances. We figured on taking enough gas for the round trip, since we doubted if there would be any to spare in Poland. Altogether, it promised to be a complicated expedition, but already we had visions of a triumphal entry into Krakow. Our ambitious plans collapsed the following morning. While Steve and I were at breakfast, I was called to the telephone. The corporal in Captain Ray's office was on the wire. I was to return to Munich at once. Major Lafarge was arriving from Frankfurt and wanted to see me that night. Plans for the trip to Krakow were indefinitely postponed. Internal conditions in Poland were too unsettled to risk returning the altarpiece. Our plans had miscarried before, but this was our first major disappointment. We had begun to look on the Polish venture as the fitting climax of our work as a special evacuation team. On the way back to Munich, Steve said he had a feeling that the team was going to be split up. Steve's misgivings were prophetic. At Craig's apartment after dinner, Bancel Lafarge outlined the plans he had for us. Colonel Delfers had acceded to Colonel de Wald's request. Lamont, Steve, and a third officer new to MFA&A work were to resume the evacuation of the salt mine at Alt-Aussee. If the snows held off, it would be possible to carry on operations there for another month or 6 weeks. I was to return to U.S. FET headquarters at Frankfurt as deputy chief of the MFA&A section, replacing Charlie Kuhn, who had just received his orders to go home. I knew that Charlie would soon be eligible for release from active duty, but had no idea that his departure was so imminent. We didn't have much to say to one another on the way to our quarters that night. Steve had already made up his mind that he wasn't going to like the new man. Lamont said that he thought it was going to be an awful anticlimax to reopen the mine, and for me, the prospect of routine administrative work at USFET was uninviting. After 3 months of strenuous and exciting field work, it wouldn't be easy to settle down in an office. All 3 of us felt that the great days were over. During our last week together in Munich, we had little time to feel sorry for ourselves. Everyone was preoccupied with the restitution program. We had our full share of the work. Another important shipment was to be made to Belgium. It was to include the Michelangelo Madonna, the 11 paintings stolen from the church in Bruges when the statue was taken, and the 4 panels by Dierbout from the famous altarpiece in the Church of St. Pierre at Louvain. These panels, which formed the wings of the altarpiece, had been removed by the Germans in August 1942. Before the First World War, one wing had been in the Berlin Gallery, the other in the Alte Pinakothek at Munich. As in the case of the Ghent altarpiece, they had been restored, unjustly according to the Germans, to Belgium by the Versailles Treaty. This shipment to Belgium represented the first practical application of the come-and-get-it theory of restitution evolved by Major Lafarge. Belgium had already received the Ghent altarpiece as token restitution. Now it was up to the Belgians to carry on at their own expense. The special representatives who came down from Brussels to supervise this initial shipment were Dr. Paul Cormans, a great technical expert, and Lieutenant Pierre Longuy of the Ministry of Fine Arts. They had their own truck, but had been unable to bring suitable packing materials. We had an ample supply of pads and blankets, which we had stored at the collecting point after our evacuation of the Goering collection. We placed them at the disposal of the Belgians. But it was Saturday, and no civilian packers were available. Dr. Cormans gratefully accepted the offer of our services. Steve, Lamont, and I loaded the truck. It was the last operation of the special evacuation team. The Belgians had no sooner departed than the French and Dutch representatives arrived. Captain Hubert Dubray for France looked more like a sportsman than a scholar, but he was a man of wide cultivation and had a sense of humor which endeared him to his associates in Munich. He and Ham Coulter were kindred spirits and became great friends. Ham, who had been responsible for the rehabilitation of both the collecting point and the Führerbau, now had 2 assistants, Captain George Lacey and Dietrich Sattler, the latter a German architect. Through this division of work, Ham found time for new duties. He took the foreign representatives in tow, arranged for their billets, their mess cards, their PX rations, and so on. It was an irritating but not a thankless job, for the recipients of his attentions were devoted to their wet nurse. The Dutch representative was Lieutenant Colonel Alphonse Vorenkamp. He was a little man with gray hair, shrewd gray eyes, and steel-rimmed spectacles. An eminent authority on Dutch painting, he had been for several years a member of the faculty at Smith College. He enjoyed the unusual distinction of having served in both the American and Dutch armies during the present war. I had met him in San Francisco in 1944, shortly after his discharge from the service. He had been a buck private, and I gathered from the story of his experiences that our army had released him in self-defense. He told me that he often had difficulty in understanding the drill sergeant. Once, without thinking, he had stepped out of formation and asked politely, "Sergeant, would you mind repeating that last order?" Vorenkamp said that he had paid dearly for his indiscretion, so dearly, in fact, that he had seriously considered changing his name from Alphonse to Latrinus. Alphonse, he said, was a ridiculous name for a Dutchman anyway. He preferred to be called Fons. Released from the army, he had gone back to his teaching. Then, only a few months ago, the Dutch government had requested his services in connection with the restitution of looted art. They had offered him a lieutenant colonelcy, and he had accepted. The Dutch, as well as the British and French, had made a practice of conferring upon qualified civilians ranks consistent with the responsibilities of given jobs. Our government's failure to do likewise, so far as the art program was concerned, resulted in a disparity in rank which frequently placed American MFA&A personnel at a great disadvantage. Of all the foreign representatives, none served his country more zealously than Franz Vohrenkamp. Throughout the fall and winter months, his convoys shuttled back and forth between Munich and Amsterdam. When I last heard from him in the late spring, he had restored to Holland more than 900 paintings, upward of 2,000 pieces of sculpture, porcelain, and glass, along with truckloads of tapestries, rugs, and furniture. I left Munich on a rainy morning at the end of September. Lamont and Steve were planning to depart for Alt-Ossie at the same time. The three of us had agreed to meet in front of the collecting point at 8:30. I was a few minutes late, and when I got there, the guard at the entrance said they had already gone. I hadn't felt so forlorn since the day Craig and I had parted in Bad Homburg months before. As I started down the steps to the command car, Franz Vohrenkamp called from the doorway. He had come to work a little earlier than usual just to see me off. He was full of waspish good humor, joked about the magnificence of my new job in Frankfurt, and promised to look me up when he came through with his first convoy. The driver stepped on the starter, and as we rounded the corner into the Brenner Strasse, Franz waved us on our way. End of section 12. Section 13 of Salt Mines and Castles by Thomas Carr Howe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by T.R. Love of Pleasant Hill, California. Mission to Amsterdam, the Wiesbaden Manifesto. I reported to Major Lafarge upon arrival. Since my visit to Frankfurt with Lamont and Steve 6 weeks before, there had been several changes in the MFA&A section. With the removal to Berlin of the monuments officers attached to the U.S. Group Control Council, our office at USFET headquarters in Frankfurt had been transferred to Höchst. The move was logical enough because we were part of the Restitution Control Branch of the Economics Division, which was located there. For all practical purposes, however, we would have been better off in Frankfurt, since our work involved daily contacts with other divisions, all located at the main headquarters. The Höchst office was a barn-like room, some 30 feet square, on the second floor of the exposition building. It required considerable ingenuity to find the room, for it was tucked in behind a row of laboratories occupied by white-coated German civilians, former employees of I.G. Farben, who were now working for the American military government. At one end of the room were desks for the chief and deputy chief. The rest of the furniture consisted of 4 long work tables and 2 small file cabinets. The staff was equally meager. Major Lafarge, Lieutenant Edith Standen, Corporal James Reeds, and a German civilian stenographer. The first few days were a period of intensive indoctrination. The morning I arrived, Bonsall defined the relationship between our office and the one at Berlin, and between us and the 2 districts of the American Zone, the Eastern District, which was under 3rd Army, and the Western District, under 7th Army. He described the Berlin office as the final authority in determining policy. In theory, if not always in fact, a given policy was adopted only after an exchange of views between the Frankfurt Höchst office and the one in Berlin. The activation of policy was our function. USFET, that is, our office, was an operational headquarters. Berlin was not. And how did we activate policy? By means of directives. Directives to whom? To 3rd Army at Munich and 7th Army at Heidelberg. That sounded simple enough, but Bonsall explained that a directive was not exactly an imperial decree. Just as it was our prerogative to activate policies approved by Berlin, so it was the prerogative of the armies to implement our directives as they deemed expedient. He reminded me that the two armies were independent and autonomous within their respective areas. In other words, we could tell them what to do, but not how to do it. Bunzel was an old hand at writing directives, knowing how to give each phrase just the right emphasis. At first, the longer ones seemed stilted and occasionally ambiguous, but I was not accustomed to military jargon. Later, I came to realize that Army communications always sounded stilted, and what I had mistaken for ambiguity was often deliberate circumlocution calculated to soften the force of an unpalatable order. Bunzel said there were more important things to worry about than the composition of directives. One was the problem of token restitutions. He was sorry to postpone the one to Poland, but that couldn't be helped. Now that France and Belgium had received theirs, Holland was next on the list. The ceremony in Brussels had made a great hit. He thought a similar affair might be arranged at The Hague. Vorenkamp was selecting a group of pictures at the collecting point. We would provide a plane to fly them to Amsterdam. Captain Ray was to notify our office as soon as Vorenkamp was ready to leave, probably within the next 2 days. In the meantime, Bunzel was having orders cut for me to go to Holland. I was to see the American ambassador, explain the idea of these token restitutions, and sound him out on the subject of planning a ceremony similar to the one our ambassador had arranged in Brussels. Colonel Anthony Biddle, chief of the Allied Contacts Section at USFET headquarters, had promised Bunzel to write a letter of introduction for me to take to The Hague. Bunzel suggested that I make tentative arrangements with the motor pool for a car and driver. It was almost noon, and Bunzel had an appointment in Frankfurt at 12:30. He just had time to catch the bus. After he left, Reeds and the stenographer went out to lunch, so Edith Standen and I had the office to ourselves. We had a lot to talk over, as I had not seen her since June when we worked together on the inventory of the Berlin Museum collections at the Reichsbank. In the meantime, she had been stationed at Höchst. When the Group CC outfit, to which she was officially attached, moved to Berlin, she had preferred to remain with the USFET office. On the organizational chart of the MFA&A section, Edith was listed as the officer in charge of technical files. Actually, she was in charge of a great many other things as well. When the chief and deputy chief were away from headquarters at the same time, and they often were, Edith took over the affairs of the section. She must have been born with these remarkable administrative gifts, for she could have had little opportunity to develop them as the cloistered curator of the Widner collection, where, as she said herself, she was accustomed to the silent padding of butlers and the spontaneous appearance of orchids and gardenias among the Rembrandts and Raphaels. I asked her if there had been any new developments regarding the proposed removal of German-owned art to the United States. Yes, there had been, but nothing conclusive. There was a cable from General Clay to the War Department early in September. Open footnote. See article, German Paintings in the National Gallery, a Protest, by Charles L. Kuhn in College Art Journal, January 1946. Close footnote. The cable spoke of holding German objects of art in trust for eventual return to the German people, but it didn't contain the clause, if and when the German nation had earned the right to their return, which had appeared in the original document. Besides the cable, there had been a communication from Berlin asking for an estimate of the cubic footage in art repositories of the American zone. It was a question impossible to answer accurately, but Bunzel and Charlie had figured out a reply, citing the approximate size of one of the repositories and leaving it up to Berlin to multiply the figures by the total number in the entire zone. Now that John Nicholas Brown and Charlie Kuhn were back in the United States, they might be able to discourage the projected removal. I had only one piece of information to contribute on the subject, a letter from George Stout saying that he had been asked by the Roberts Commission to give an opinion, based on purely technical grounds, of the risk involved in sending paintings to America. He did so, stating that to remove them would cube the risk of leaving them in Germany. When Corporal Reeds returned to the office, Edith and I went across the street to the officers' mess. While we were at lunch, she told me that Jim Reeds had been a discovery of George's. He had been with George and Bansel at their office in Wiesbaden. Jim was a tall, serious fellow with sandy hair and a turned-up nose. Edith said that he had been a medical student before the war and that he came from Missouri. There was so much paperwork to do in the office that he never got caught up. The German typist was slow and inaccurate. Jim had to do over nearly half the letters he gave her to copy, but his patience was inexhaustible and he never complained. Bansel didn't get back from Frankfurt until late in the afternoon. The return of the Viet-Stoss altarpiece had come up again, and he had had a long talk about it with the Polish liaison officer at USFET, who was a nephew of the Archbishop of Krakow. After that, he had had a session with Colonel A.J. de la Brutuche, the French liaison officer, and, for good measure, he had to take up the problem of clearance for the 2 Czech representatives who would be arriving in a few days. He said wearily that practically all of his days were like that, now that Restitution was going full speed ahead. I told him that I had had an uneventful but profitable afternoon going through the correspondence which had accumulated on his desk. There had been several telephone calls, among them one from Colonel Walter Schloss. Bansel said he would answer that one in person, as he wanted to introduce me to the colonel, who was chief of the Restitution Control Branch. Restitution involved settling the claims of the occupied countries for everything the Germans had taken from them. These claims covered every conceivable kind of property: factory equipment, vehicles, barges, machinery, racehorses, livestock, household furniture, etc. The colonel's office was at the end of the corridor. On our way down the hall, Bansel said that the army could do with a few more officers like Colonel Schloss. This observation didn't give me a very clear picture of the colonel, but when I met him, I knew what Bansel meant. There was an unassuming friendliness and simplicity about him that I didn't usually associate with full colonels. His interest in the activities of the MFA&A section was genuine and personal. He was particularly fond of Bansel and Edith, and during our visit with him that afternoon, spoke admiringly of the work which they and Charlie Kuhn had done. While other sections of the Restitution Control Branch were still generalizing about restitution, the MFA&A section had tackled the problem realistically. It wasn't a question of mapping out a program which might work. The program did work. The wisdom and foresight of Bansel's planning appealed to the practical side of Colonel Schloss's nature, and throughout the months of our association with him, he was never too busy to help us when we went to him with our troubles. Bansel and I took the 7 o'clock bus over to Frankfurt that evening. We had dinner at the officers' mess in the casino behind USFET headquarters. We were joined there by Lieutenant William Lovegrove, the officer whom Bansel had selected as our representative in Paris in connection with the restitution of looted artworks to the French. With the arrival of the French representative in Munich, regular shipments would be departing for France. Their destination in Paris was to be the Musée des Jeux de Paume, which was now the headquarters of the Commission de Récupération Artistique. The commission, composed of officials from the French museums, charged with the task of sorting and distributing the plundered treasures. Among the officials selected to assist in this work was Captain Rose Villan, the courageous French woman who, as I mentioned earlier, had spied on the Nazi thieves in that same museum during the occupation. We had roughly estimated that it would require from 3 to 6 months to send back the main bulk of the French loot from Germany. Mass evacuation, as I have mentioned before, had the advantage of accelerating restitution. It had the disadvantage of rendering difficult our procedure of evaluating and photographing objects before they were returned. It was our intention that Lieutenant Lovegrove should obtain the desired photographs and appraisals. American military establishments in France were being drastically reduced, but we planned to attach him to the U.S. FET mission to France. We had been told that the mission would be withdrawn in the early spring. If Lovegrove's work weren't finished by that time, Bonsall said it might be possible to attach him to our Paris embassy when the mission folded. When Bonsall introduced me to Lovegrove that evening at the casino, I thought he would be very much at home in the embassy. He was of medium height, bald, had a pink and white complexion, and wore a small mustache. He was self-possessed without being blasé. Lovegrove was a sculptor and had lived in Paris for many years before the war. Bonsall said that he spoke a more perfect French than most Frenchmen. Subsequent developments proved the wisdom of Bonsall's choice. Lovegrove was exceedingly popular with his French associates at the Musée du Jeu de Paume. His extraordinary tact and his capacity for hard work were equally remarkable. I particularly remember our last meeting. It was in February when I was stopping briefly in Paris on my way home from Germany. By that time, hundreds of carloads of stolen art had been received at the Jeu de Paume. There were one or two final matters which I wished to take up with Monsieur Henrot and Monsieur Dreyfus, members of the Commission de Récupération Artistique. When Lovegrove and I arrived at the museum, we found these two charming elderly gentlemen in their office. With them was Monsieur David Ville. He was examining a fine gold snuff-box. The office was littered with gold and silver objects. They were part of the fabulous collection which Lamont, Steve, and I had packed by candlelight in the castle of Neuschwanstein 6 months ago. During the second week of October, I left for Amsterdam. It was a 300-mile drive from Frankfurt. Cassidy, the driver of the Jeep, was a New Jersey farm boy who, unlike most drivers, preferred long trips to short local runs. The foothills of the Taunus Mountains were bright with fall coloring along the back road to Limburg. From there, we turned west to the Rhine. Then, skirting the east bank of the river, we crossed over into the British zone at Cologne. From Cologne, where we lunched at a British mess, our road led through Duisburg, Wissel, and the skeleton of Emmerich. We crossed the Dutch frontier at 5 and continued through battered Arnhem to Utrecht. Utrecht was full of exuberant Canadians. I stopped at the headquarters of the local town major to inquire about a mess for transient officers. A friendly lieutenant, a blonde Dutch girl on his arm, was on his way to supper and suggested that I join them. He said that Cassidy could eat at a Red Cross club. The dining room in the officers' hotel was noisy and crowded. Most of the officers, the lieutenant explained, were going home in a few days. It was good to be in a city which, superficially at least, showed no scars of battle. We reached Amsterdam about 9:30. At night, the canals were confusing. Cassidy and I looked in vain for the town major. Finally, we found a Canadian leave hotel. The enlisted man on duty at the desk dispensed with the formality of the billet permit I should have obtained from the town major, and assigned us rooms on the same floor. Cassidy decided that the Canadians were a democratic outfit. Bonsall had instructed me to inform the Dutch Restitution Commission, known as the CGR, that Lieutenant Colonel Vorenkamp was scheduled to reach Amsterdam at noon on the day following my arrival. So the next morning I went to the headquarters of the commission to deliver Major Lafarge's message. The commission occupied the stately old Goudstücke house on the Heerengracht. Before the war, Goedsticker had been a great Dutch art dealer. In the galleries of this house had been held many fine exhibitions of Dutch painting. During the German occupation of the Netherlands, an unscrupulous Nazi named Miedel had acquired the entire Goedsticker stock from the dealer's widow. We had found many of the Goedsticker pictures at Alt-Assi and in the Goering collection. Bonsall had told me to ask for Captain Robert de Vries. I was informed that the captain was in London. In his stead, Nicolas Vroom, his scholarly young deputy, received me. He had had no word of Colonel Vorenkamp's impending arrival. Vroom transmitted the message immediately to Jonkheer Roel, director of the Rijksmuseum. 20 minutes later, this distinguished gentleman appeared in Vroom's office. With him were Lieutenant Colonel H. Polis and Captain Termeer, both of whom were attached to the CGR. They were delighted to know about the plane which I told them was due at Schiphol Airport. Telephonic connections with Munich had not yet been reestablished. They had to depend on the U.S. FET mission at The Hague for transmission of all messages from the American zone. It often took days for a telegram to get through. There was barely time enough to telephone for a truck to meet the plane. Also, Mr. Van Hagen, Permanent Secretary of Education and Science, must be notified at once. I was told that he would accompany us to the airport. In another hour, we were all on our way to Schiphol. We waited 2 hours at the field, and still no sign of the plane from Munich. The weather was fine at the airport, but there were reports of heavy fog to the south. At 2 o'clock, we returned to Amsterdam and lunched at the Dutch officers' mess. My hosts apologized for the food. They said that they no longer received British Army rations. The menu was prepared from civilian supplies. It was a Spartan diet, cheese, bread, and jam, and weak coffee. But they shared it so hospitably that only a graceless guest would have complained of the lack of variety. Captain Termeer said that it was more palatable than the tulip bulbs he had lived on the winter before. After lunch, Cassidy and I drove to the USFET mission at The Hague. Colonel Ira W. Black, chief of the mission, arranged for me to see the American ambassador. The temporary offices of our embassy were located in a tall brick building on the edge of the city. I presented Colonel Biddle's letter to Mr. Stanley Hornbeck, the ambassador, who looked more like a successful businessman than a diplomat. He frowned as he read, and when he had finished, said gruffly, "Commander, Tony Biddle is a charming fellow, and I'm very fond of him. I'd like to be obliging, but we've had too damn many celebrations and ceremonies in this country already. We need more hard work instead of more holidays. It's very nice about the pictures coming back, but steel mills and machinery would be a lot more welcome." I hadn't expected this reaction, and having had little experience with ambassadors, irascible or otherwise, I hardly knew what to say. After an embarrassing pause, I ventured the remark that a very simple ceremony would be enough. After his first outburst, the ambassador relented to the extent of saying he'd think it over. As I left his office, he called after me, "My bark's worse than my bite." On my way back to Amsterdam, I concluded unhappily that as a diplomatic errand boy, I was a washout. I'd better go back to loading trucks. When I reached the hotel, I found a message that the plane with Vorenkamp and the pictures had arrived. I met Fons the following morning at the Goudsticker house. He introduced me to Lieutenant Hans Jaffe, a Dutch monuments officer who bore a striking resemblance to Robert Louis Stevenson. Several weeks later, Jaffe was chosen as the Dutch representative for the Western District of the American Zone. His work at 7th Army headquarters in Heidelberg was comparable to that of Vorenkamp's in Munich. He was intelligent and industrious. During the next few months, he was as successful in his investigation of looted Dutch artworks as Fons was in Bavaria. Yaffe didn't reap so rich a harvest, but that was only because there was less loot in his territory. He and Fons took me to the Rijksmuseum, where the 26 paintings from Munich were being unpacked. They were a hand-picked group consisting mainly of 17th-century Dutch masters, which included 4 Rembrandts. One of the Rembrandts was the still life with dead peacocks, which Lamont and I had taken out of the mine at Alt-Assi. There was a 27th picture. It was the fraudulent Vermeer of the Goering collection. Fons had brought it back to be used as evidence against its author, the notorious Van Meegeren. The Rijksmuseum was holding a magnificent exhibition, appropriately entitled The Return of the Old Masters. Among the 140 masterpieces which had been stored in underground shelters for the past 5 years were 6 Vermeers, 9 paintings by Frans Hals, and 17 Rembrandts, including the famous Night Watch. That evening, Fons took Cassidy and me to the country place occupied by the officers of the CGR. It was called Oud-Boezem and was near Naarden, about 15 miles from Amsterdam. The luxurious house had been the property of a well-known Dutch collaborator. Many high-ranking Nazis had been entertained there. As a mark of special favor, I was given the suite which had been used by Goering. At dinner, I sat between Colonel W.C. Posthumus Meus, chief of the Restitution Commission, and Fons Vorenkamp. The colonel, to the regret of his associates, was soon to relinquish his duties in order to accept an important diplomatic post in Canada. Toward the end of the meal, Fons asked me how I had made out with the ambassador. I gave a non-committal reply. He looked at me shrewdly through his steel-rimmed spectacles and said, "We would not expect your ambassador to arrange a ceremony. That is for us to do. It is for us to express our gratitude to General Eisenhower." Fons was as good as his word. A few weeks later, officials of the Netherlands government arranged a luncheon in one of the rooms of the Rijksmuseum. It was the first affair of its kind in the history of the museum. Only the simplest food was served, but the table was set with rare old silver, porcelain, and glass. Colonel Kloos and Bonsall represented USFET headquarters. I was told that no one enjoyed himself more than the American ambassador. The next morning, Fons suggested that I return with him in the plane. He had it entirely to himself, except for the empty packing cases, which he was taking back to Munich. He said that the slight detour to Frankfurt could be easily arranged. So I sent Cassidy back in the Jeep, and at noon, Fons and I, sole occupants of the C-47, which had been chartered in the name of General Eisenhower, took off from Schiphol Airport. An hour and 20 minutes later, we landed at Frankfurt. Before the end of October, a token restitution was made to Czechoslovakia. The objects chosen were the famous 14th-century Hohenfurth altarpiece and the collections of the Army Museum at Prague. Both had been stolen by the Nazis. The altarpiece, evacuated from the Alt-Assi mine, was now at the central collecting point in Munich. The Army Museum collections were stored at Schloss near Bamberg. Lieutenant Colonel František Freko and Captain Egon Suk, as representatives of the Czech government, were invited to USFET headquarters. We arranged for them to proceed from there to Schloss, where they were met by Lieutenant Walter Horn. I have mentioned Horn before as the monuments officer whose remarkable sleuthing resulted in recovery of the 5 pieces of the coronation regalia at Nürnberg. While the Czech officers were en route, we directed Captain Ray at 3rd Army to arrange for the delivery of the Hohenfurth panels to Schloss. Captain Ray, in turn, designated Lieutenant Commander Coulter to transport them from Munich. Both Ham Coulter and I had received our additional half-stripe earlier in the month. This joint operation was carried out successfully, and in succeeding months, restitution to Czechoslovakia became a matter of routine shipments at regular intervals. Also, before the end of October, we became involved in the complicated problem of the Schloss altarpiece. Major Charles S. Stryker was selected as the Polish representative. The major spent several days at our office in Höchst, studying our files for additional data on Polish loot in the American zone before continuing to Munich and Nürnberg. Because of the condition of the roads, the actual return of the altarpiece as a token restitution to Poland was delayed until early spring. While we were in the midst of these negotiations, Bonsall conferred with Colonel Hayden Smith at U.S. FET headquarters in Frankfurt on the subject of the proposed removal of German-owned works of art to the United States. Colonel Smith was the Chief of Staff to Major General C.L. Adcock, Deputy Director of the Office of Military Government, U.S. Zone. Bonsall impressed upon the colonel the practical difficulties involved and stressed the technical, not the moral objections to shipping valuable works of art to America. As a result of this conference, the colonel asked Bonsall to prepare a memorandum on the subject for submission to his chief. The finished memorandum, which Edith and I helped Bonsall prepare, followed the general pattern of a staff study, a statement of the problem with specific suggestions relating to its solution. It contained an eloquent plea for the importation of additional MFA&A personnel to assume responsibility for the project, and called attention to acute shortages in packing materials and transportation facilities. It also pointed out that the advisability of moving fragile objects across the ocean would be balanced against the advantages of leaving them in the central collecting points, all three of which had been made weatherproof months before and were now provided with sufficient coal to prevent deterioration of the objects during the winter months. Nothing came of our recommendations. Within 2 weeks, Colonel Harry McBride, Administrator of the National Gallery in Washington, arrived in Berlin to expedite the first shipment. He flew down to Frankfurt 2 days later to discuss the ways and means with Major Lafarge. We learned from him that General Clay's recommendation for immediate removal had been approved by the highest national authority. The general was now in Washington. The futility of protest was obvious. Bonsall told the colonel that our monuments officers were strongly opposed to the project. He said that some of them might request transfer rather than comply with the order. The colonel replied that such requests would, in all probability, be refused. The only other alternative, open defiance of the order, could have but one consequence, a court-martial. And assuming that our officers elected to face court-martial, what would be gained? Nothing, according to the colonel. The order would still be carried out. If trained MFA&A personnel were not available, then the work would have to be done by such officers and men as might be obtainable, experienced or not. Bonsall realized that his primary duty was the protection and salvage of artworks. If he deliberately left them at the mercy of whatever troops might be available to do the packing, then he would be guilty of dereliction of duty. This interpretation afforded him some consolation. As Bonsall predicted, our monuments officers lost no time in registering their disapproval. They expressed their sentiments as follows. U.S. Forces European Theater, open footnote, as printed by Kuhn in College Art Journal, January 1946, page 81, also in Magazine of Art, February 1946, and New York Times, February 7, 1946, close footnote. Germany, 7 November 1945. 1. We, the undersigned, Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives Specialist Officers of the Armed Forces of the United States, wish to make known our convictions regarding the transportation to the United States of works of art, the property of German institutions or nationals, for purposes of protective custody. 2. A. We are unanimously agreed that the transportation of those works of art undertaken by the United States Army upon direction from the highest national authority establishes a precedent which is neither morally tenable nor trustworthy. B. Since the beginning of United States participation in the war, it has been the declared policy of the Allied forces, so far as military necessity would permit, to protect and preserve from deterioration consequent upon the processes of war all monuments, documents, or other objects of historic, artistic, cultural, or archaeological value. The war is at an end, and no doctrine of military necessity can now be invoked for the further protection of the objects to be moved, for the reason that depots and personnel, both fully competent for their protection, have been inaugurated and are functioning. C. The Allied nations are at present preparing to prosecute individuals for the crime of sequestering, under pretext of protective custody, the cultural treasures of German-occupied countries. A major part of the indictment follows upon the reasoning that even though these individuals were acting under military orders, the dictates of a higher ethical law made it incumbent upon them to refuse to take part in or countenance the fulfillment of these orders. We, the undersigned, feel it our duty to point out, though as members of the armed forces we will carry out the orders we receive, we are thus put before any candid eyes as no less culpable than those whose prosecution we affect to sanction. 3. We wish to state that from our own knowledge no historical grievance will rankle so long or be the cause of so much justified bitterness as the removal for any reason of a part of the heritage of any nation, even if that heritage be interpreted as a prize of war. And though this removal may be done with every intention of altruism, we are none the less convinced that it is our duty, individually and collectively, to protest against it, and that though our obligations are to the nation which we owe allegiance, there are yet further obligations to common justice, decency, and the establishment of the power of right, not might, among civilized nations. This document was drafted and signed by a small group of monuments officers at the central collecting point in Wiesbaden. Before being submitted to Major Lafarge for whatever action he deemed appropriate, it was signed by 24 of the 32 monuments officers in the American zone. The remaining 8 chose either to submit individual letters expressing similar views or orally to express like sentiments. The document came to be known as the Wiesbaden Manifesto. Army regulations forbade the publication of such a statement, hence its submission to Major Lafarge as chief of the MFA&A section. Further protests against the policy which prompted the Wiesbaden Manifesto appeared in the United States a few months later. The action of our government was sharply criticized and vigorously defended in the press. Letters to and from the State Department and a petition submitted to the President concerning the issue appear in the appendix to this book. Preparations for the shipment, appropriately nicknamed Westward Ho, took precedence over all other activities of the MFA&A office during the next 3 weeks. Its size was determined soon after Colonel McBride's arrival. General Clay cabled from Washington requesting this information and the shipping date. After hastily consulting us, our Berlin office replied that 200 paintings could be made ready for removal within 10 days. The next problem was to decide how the selection was to be made. Should the pictures be chosen from the 3 central collecting points, Munich, Wiesbaden, and Marburg? Time was short. It would be preferable to take them from one depot. Wiesbaden was decided upon. Quality had been stressed. The best of the Kaiser Friedrich Museum pictures were at Wiesbaden. The decision to confine the selection to the one central collecting point had the additional advantage of avoiding the disruption of MFA&A work at the other two depots, Munich and Marburg. Craig Smythe had long been apprehensive about Westward Ho, feeling that any incursion on the Bavarian state collections would be disastrous to his organization at the Munich collecting point. He said that his entire staff of non-Nazi museum specialists would walk out. This would seriously impede the restitution program in the Eastern Military District. So far as Marburg was concerned, I had been in the office the day Bonsall told Walter Hancock of the decision to take German-owned works of art to America. Walker had looked at Bonsall as though he hadn't understood him. Then he said simply, "In that case, I can't go back to Marburg. Everything that we were able to accomplish was possible because I had the confidence of certain people. I can't go back and tell them that I have betrayed them." And he hadn't gone back to Marburg. Instead, he went to Heidelberg for 2 days without telling anyone where he was going. When he finally returned, it was only to close up his work at Marburg, in the course of which he undertook to explain as best he could to Professor Hamann, the distinguished old German scholar with whom he had been associated, the decision concerning the removal of the pictures. I quoted the official statement, Walker said, about the paintings being held in trust for the German people, and added that there was no reason to doubt it. Very slowly, he said, "If they take our old art, we must try to create a fine new art." Then, after a long pause, he added, "I never thought they would take them." Once it had been decided to limit selection of the paintings to the Wiesbaden collecting point, there arose the question of appointing an officer properly qualified to handle the job. It called for speed, discrimination, and an expert knowledge of packing. There was a 10-day deadline to be met. 200 pictures had to be chosen, and the packing would have to be done with meticulous care. We considered the possibilities. Captain Walter Farmer couldn't be spared from his duties as director of the collecting point. Lieutenant Samuel Ratensky, monuments officer for Greater Hesse, was an architect, not a museum man. Captain Joseph Kelleher was one of our ablest officers, but he was just out of the hospital, where he had been laid up for 3 months with a broken hip. The doctor had released him on condition that he be given easy assignments for the next few weeks. At this critical juncture, Lamont Moore telephoned from Munich. He and Steve had just completed the evacuation of the mine at Alt-Ossi. Lamont said that they were coming up to Frankfurt. Steve had enough points to go home, enough and to spare. Lamont thought that he'd take some leave. Bonsall signaled from the opposite desk. I told Lamont to forget about the leave, that we had a job for him. Bonsall sighed with relief. Lamont's was a different kind of sigh. Lamont's arrival was providential. Aside from his obvious qualifications for the Wiesbaden assignment, he and Colonel McBride were old friends from the National Gallery where, as I have mentioned before, Lamont had been director of the educational program. The colonel was content to leave everything in his hands. Lamont and I spent an evening together studying a list of the pictures stored at Wiesbaden. He typed out a tentative selection. The next day, he and the colonel went over to the collecting point for a preliminary inspection. Steve was momentarily tempted by the prospect of having a part in the undertaking, but when I told him there was a chance of his being included in a draft of officers scheduled for immediate redeployment, he decided that he'd had his share of packing. Maybe he'd come back in the spring if there was work still to be done. His parting gift was the Mercedes-Benz, a temporary legacy as it turned out. 2 weeks later, the car was stolen from the motor pool where I had left it for minor repairs. Steve didn't like the idea of having to wait at a processing center before proceeding to his port of embarkation. He cheered up when he learned that he was headed for one near Marburg. He went off in high spirits at the prospect of seeing his old friend Walker Hancock again. End of section 13. Section 14 of Salt Mines and Castles by Thomas Carr Howe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by T.R. Love of Pleasant Hill, California. Mission to Amsterdam, the Wiesbaden Manifesto, Part 2. Under Lamont's skillful supervision, preparations for the shipment proceeded according to schedule. Lamont chose Captain Kelleher as his assistant. Together they located the cases from Captain Farmer's records. Only a few of the Kaiser Friedrich pictures had been taken out of the cases in which they had been originally packed for removal from Berlin to the Memoirs mine. The larger cases contained as many as a dozen pictures. It was slow work opening the cases and withdrawing a particular canvas for repacking. Seldom were any two of the specified 200 paintings in a single case. When they were all finally assembled, each one was photographed. In the midst of the proceedings, the supply of film and paper ran out. The nearest replacements were at Mannheim. A day was lost in obtaining the necessary authorization to requisition fresh supplies. It took the better part of another day to make the trip to Mannheim and back. Thanks to Lamont's careful calculations, maximum use was made of the original cases in repacking the 200 paintings after a photographic record had been made of their condition. While these operations were in progress, detailed plans for the actual shipment of the paintings had to be worked out. Colonel McBride and Bonsall took up the matter of shipping space with General Ross, Chief of Transportation. Sailing schedules were consulted. An Army transport, the James Parker, was selected. As an alternative, temporary consideration was given to the idea of trucking the pictures to Bremen and sending them by a naval vessel from there. But the Bremen sailing schedules were unsatisfactory. A special metal car was requisitioned to transport the cases from Frankfurt by way of Paris to Le Havre. A 24-hour guard detail was appointed to accompany the car from Frankfurt to the ship. Trucks and escort vehicles were procured for the 25-mile trip from Wiesbaden to the Frankfurt rail yards. It was decided that Lamont should be responsible for delivering the pictures to the National Gallery in Washington, where they were to be placed in storage. Bonsall drafted the orders. He worked on them a full day. It took 2 more days to have them cut. They were unique in one respect. Lamont, a second lieutenant, was appointed officer in charge. His designated assistant was a commander in the Navy. This was Commander Keith Merrill, an old friend of Colonel McBride's, who happened to be in Frankfurt. He offered his service to the colonel and subsequently crossed on the James Parker with Lamont and the pictures. Lamont and Joe Kelleher finished the packing 1 day ahead of schedule. The 45 cases, lined with waterproof paper, were delivered to the Frankfurt rail yards and loaded onto the car. From there, the car was switched to the station and attached to the night train for Paris. Bonsall and I returned to the office to take up where we had left off. As usual, Edith Standen had taken care of everything while we had been preoccupied with the Westward Ho shipment. There had been no major crises. Judging from the weekly field reports, restitution to the Dutch and the French was proceeding without interruption. Edith produced a stack of miscellaneous notations. The Belgian representative had arrived in Munich. The Stockholm Museum had offered a supply of lumber to be used in repairing war-damaged German buildings of cultural importance. There had been 2 inquiries concerning a modification of Law 52, the military government regulation which forbade trafficking in works of art. A report from Würzburg indicated that emergency repairs to the roof of the residence were nearing completion. Lieutenant Rohremer had called from Heidelberg about the books at Offenbach. Of all the problems which confronted the MFA&A section, none was more baffling than that of the books at Offenbach. There were more than 2 million of them. They had been assembled from Jewish libraries throughout Europe by the Institut zur Erforschung der Judenfrage, Institute for the Investigation of the Jewish Question, at Frankfurt. At the close of the war, a small part of the collection was found in a large private house in Frankfurt. The rest was discovered in a repository to the north of the city at Hungen. The house in Frankfurt had been bombed, leaving undamaged only the books stored in the cellar. 120,000 volumes were removed from the damp cellar to the Rothschild Library, which, though damaged, was still intact. Examination of this portion of the collection revealed that it contained more than 60 libraries looted from occupied countries. Subsequently, the rest of the collection was transferred from Hungen to an enormous warehouse at Offenbach, across the river from Frankfurt. The ultimate disposition of this library, probably the greatest of its kind in the world, was the subject of heated discussions, both written and oral. Several leading Jewish scholars had expressed the hope that it could be kept together and eventually established in some center of international study. Our immediate responsibility was the care of the books in their two present locations. That alone was exceedingly difficult. It would take months, perhaps years, to make an inventory. Judge Samuel Rifkin, General Clay's advisor on Jewish affairs, had requested that 25,000 volumes be made available for distribution among the DP camps. I referred the request to the two archivists who had recently joined our staff, Paul Vanderbilt and Edgar Breitenbach. While I sympathized with the tragic plight of the Jewish DPs, there were the unidentified legal owners of the books to be taken into account. One of our archivists felt that we should accede to the judge's request. The other disagreed. The matter was referred to Berlin for a decision. After several weeks, we received word from Berlin that no books were to be released. The judge persisted. 10 days later, Berlin reconsidered. The books could be released, that is, 25,000 of them, on condition that no rare or irreplaceable volumes were included in the selection. Also, the volumes chosen were to be listed on a custody receipt. Up to the time of my departure from Frankfurt, no books had been released. During the latter part of November, we concentrated on future personnel requirements for the MFA&A program in the American zone. Current directives indicated that drastic reductions in military government installations throughout the zone could be expected in the course of the next 6 or 8 months. Already we had begun to feel the impact of the Army's accelerated redeployment program. Bonsall and I took stock of our present resources. We had lost 4 officers and 3 enlisted men since the first of the month. To offset them, we had gained 2 civilians, but they were archivists, urgently needed in a specialized field of our work. We couldn't count on them as replacements. We drew up a chart showing the principal MFA&A offices and depots in each of the 3 Länder. In Bavaria, for example, there were at Munich the Land Office and the Central Collecting Point, a newly established archival collecting point at Oberammergau, and the Auxiliary Collecting Point at Bamberg, the 2 secondary offices, one in Upper Bavaria, another in Lower Bavaria. In Greater Hesse, there were the Land Office and the Central Collecting Point at Wiesbaden, the offices at Frankfurt and Kassel, and the collecting points at Offenbach and Marburg. In Württemberg-Baden, the smallest of the 3 Länder, the Land Office was at Stuttgart. There was a secondary one at Karlsruhe. The principal repositories requiring MFA&A supervision were the great mines at Heilbronn and Kockendorf. We hoped that certain of these establishments could be closed out in a few months. Others would continue to operate for an indefinite period. We regarded the land offices as permanent, likewise the collecting points, with the exception of Marburg, and Marburg would have to be maintained until it had been thoroughly sifted for loot, or until we received authorization to effect interzonal transfers. Most of the Rhineland museums were in the British zone, but the collections were at Marburg. The British had requested their return. Until our Berlin office approved the request, we could do nothing. It was impossible to make an accurate forecast of our personnel needs. Nevertheless, we entered on the chart tentative reductions with accompanying dates. The chart would serve as a basic guide in the allocation of civilian positions when the conversion program got seriously underway. A number of our officers had already signified their intentions of converting to civilian status if the promised program ever materialized. Early in December, Bonsall went home on 30 days' leave. Allowing 2 weeks for transportation each way, he would be gone about 2 months. In his absence, I was acting chief of the section. Under the Navy's new point system, I had been eligible for release on the 1st of November, but had requested an extension of active duty in anticipation of Bonsall's departure. I was not looking forward with enthusiasm to the period of his absence because of the personnel problems which lay ahead. My apprehensions were justified. Our chart, based on a realistic concept of the work yet to be done, was rejected by the personnel section. I was told that each land could draw up its own TO, table of organization. Perhaps there could be some coordination at a later date. Even the TO of our own office at USFET was thrown back at us with the discouraging comment that the proposed civil service ratings would have to be downgraded. During the next 8 weeks, there must have been a dozen personnel conferences between the top brass of USFET and the military governors of the 3 Linde, and between them and the moguls of the Group Control Council. Not once, to my knowledge, was the MFA&A section consulted. For a while, I exhorted applicants for civilian MFA&A jobs to be patient, but as the weeks went by and the job allocations failed to materialize, applications were withdrawn. Stars and Stripes contributed to my discomfort with glittering forecasts of military government jobs paying from $7,000 to $10,000 a year. There were positions which paid such salaries, but Stars and Stripes might have stressed the fact that there were many more which paid less. I remember one mousy little sergeant who applied for a job with us. In civilian life, he had received a salary of $1,200 a year. On his application blank, he stipulated as the minimum he would accept the sum of $6,000. Fortunately, there were diversions from these endless personnel problems. Edith and I fell into the habit of going over to Wiesbaden on Saturday afternoons. It was a relief to escape from the impersonal life at our headquarters to the friendly country atmosphere of the land and city detachments. We were particularly fond of our monuments officers there. They were a dissimilar trio: Captain Farmer, Lieutenant Ratensky, and Captain Kelleher. Walter Farmer presided over the collecting point. Walter seldom relaxed. He was an intense fellow, jumpy in his movements and unconsciously brusque in conversation. He was an excellent host, loved showing us about the collecting point, particularly his treasure room with its wonderful medieval objects, and at the end of a tour invariably produced a bottle of Tokay in his office. Sam Ratensky, MFA&A officer for the land, was short, slender, and had red hair. In civilian life, he had been associated with Frank Lloyd Wright and was deeply interested in city planning. Sam usually looked harassed, but his patience and understanding were inexhaustible. He was accurate in his appraisals of people and had a quiet sense of humor. Joe Kelleher, Sam's deputy, was a black Irishman. The war had temporarily interrupted his brilliant career in the fine arts department at Princeton. At 28, Joe had the poise, balance, and tolerance of a man twice that age. With wit and charm added to these soberer qualities, he was a dangerously persuasive character. On one occasion, during Bonsel's absence, he all but succeeded in hypnotizing our office into assigning a disproportionate number of our best officers to the MFA&A activities of Greater Hesse. When Sam Rotensky went home in February, Joe succeeded him as MFA&A officer for the land. He held this position until his own release several months later. His intelligent supervision of the work was a significant contribution to the success of the American Fine Arts program in Germany. Another monuments officer whose visits to Wiesbaden rivaled Edith's and mine in frequency was Captain Everett Parker Leslie, Jr. He disliked his given name and preferred to be called Bill. Leslie had been in Europe since the invasion. He was known as the stormy petrel of MFA&A, and with good reason. He was brilliant and unpredictable. A master of oral and written invective, he was terrible in his denunciation of stupidity and incompetence. During the fall months, Bill was attached to the 15th Army with headquarters at Bad Nauheim. This was the Paper Army, so called because its function was the compilation of a history of the war. Bill was writing a report of MFA&A activities during combat. He was a virtuoso of the limerick. I was proud of my own repertoire, but Bill knew all of mine and 50 more of his own composing. He usually telephoned me at the office when he had turned out a particularly good one. Upon the completion of his report for 15th Army, Leslie was appointed MFA&A officer at Frankfurt. As a part of his duties, he assumed responsibility for the 2 million books at Offenbach and the Rothschild Library. Within a week, he had submitted a report on the 2 depots and drafted practical plans for their effective reorganization. While Walter Farmer was on leave in England before Christmas, Joe Kelleher took charge of the Wiesbaden collecting point. The Dutch and French Restitution representatives had gone home for the holidays. Joe had the spare time to examine some of the unopened cases. He asked Edith and me to come over one evening. He said that he might have a surprise for us. I said we'd come and asked if I might bring Colonel Schloss, chief of the Restitution Control Branch. The colonel had never seen the collecting point. We drove over in the colonel's car. After early dinner with Joe at the city detachment, we went down to the collecting point. Joe unlocked the treasure room and switched on the lights. The colonel whistled when he looked around the room. "Those are the Polish church treasures which the Nazis swiped," said Joe, pointing casually to the gold and silver objects stacked on shelves and tables. "There's something a lot more exciting in that box." He walked over to a packing case about 5 feet square, which stood in the center of the room. The lid had been unscrewed, but was still in place. It was marked in black letters, Kiste 28 Egypt, Abteilung Bunte Königin, Tel el Amarna, nicht kippen. Case 28, Egyptian Department, Painted Queen, Tel el Amarna, don't tilt. Joe grinned with satisfaction as I read the markings. The Painted Queen, Queen Nefertiti. This celebrated head, the most beautiful piece of Egyptian sculpture in the world, had been one of the great treasures of the Berlin Museum. It was a momentous occasion. There was every reason to believe that the German museum authorities had packed the head with proper care. Even so, the case had been moved around a good deal in the meantime, first from the Merkers mine to the vaults of the Reichsbank in Frankfurt, and then from Frankfurt to Wiesbaden. There was not much point in speculating about that now. We'd know the worst in a few minutes. Joe and I laid the lid aside. The box was filled with a white packing material. At first I thought it was cotton, but it wasn't. It was glass wool. In the very center of the box lay the head, swathed in silk paper. Gingerly we lifted her from the case and placed her on the table. We unwound the silk paper. Nefertiti was unharmed and as bewitching as ever. She was well named, The beautiful one is here. While we studied her from every angle, Jo recounted the story of the Nefertiti, her discovery and subsequent abduction to Berlin. She was the wife of Akhenaten, enlightened pharaoh of the 14th century B.C. This portrait of her was excavated in the winter of 1912 by Dr. Ludwig Borchardt, famous German Egyptologist, on the site of Tel el Amarna, Akhenaten's capital. In compliance with the regulations of the Egyptian government, Borchardt submitted a list of his finds at Tel el Amarna to Monsieur Maspero of the Cairo Museum. According to the story, Maspero merely glanced at the list to make certain that a 50-50 division had been made and did not actually examine the items. The head was taken to Berlin and placed in storage until after the First World War. When it was placed on exhibition in 1920, the Egyptian government protested loudly that Dr. Borchardt had deceived the authorities of the Cairo Museum and demanded the immediate return of the head. The Egyptian government was again pressing its claim in March 1946. After replacing Nefertiti in her case, Jo showed the colonel the collection of rare medieval treasures, including those of the Guth family, patens, chalices, and reliquaries of exquisite workmanship dating from the 11th and 12th century. With a fine sense of showmanship, he saved the most spectacular piece till the last, the famous crown of St. Stephen, the first Christian king of Hungary, crowned by the Pope in the year 1000. It was adorned with enamel plaques, bordered with pearls, and studded with great uncut gems. Jo said there was a difference of opinion among scholars as to the exact date and provenance of the enamels. The crown was surmounted by a bent gold cross. According to Jo, the cross had been bent for 400 years and would never be straightened. During the 16th century, the safety of the crown was endangered. It was entrusted to the care of a Hungarian noblewoman who concealed it in a compartment under the seat of her carriage. The space was small, and when the lid was closed and weighted down by the occupant of the carriage, the cross got bent. The Hungarian coronation regalia included 3 other pieces: a sword, an orb, and a scepter. The scepter was extremely beautiful. The stock was of rich gold filigree and terminated in a spherical ornament of carved rock crystal. The regalia was kept in a specially constructed iron trunk with 3 locks, the keys to which were entrusted to 3 different nobles. At the close of the present war, American troops apprehended a Hungarian officer with the trunk. Perhaps he was trying to safeguard the regalia as his predecessor in the 16th century had done. In any case, the American authorities thought they'd better relieve him of that grave responsibility. A few days after our visit to Wiesbaden with Colonel Schloss, I received a letter from home enclosing a clipping from the December 7th edition of the New York Times. The clipping read as follows: $80 million paintings arrived from Europe on Army transport. A valuable store of art, said to consist entirely of paintings worth upwards of $80 million, arrived here last night from Europe in the holds of the Army transport James Parker. Where the paintings came from and where they are going was a mystery, and no Army officer on the pier at 44th Street and North River, where the Parker docked with 2,483 service passengers, would discuss the shipment or even admit it was on board. It was learned elsewhere that a special detail of Army officers was on the ship during the night to take charge of the consignment, which will be unloaded today. Unusual precautions were taken to keep the arrival of the paintings secret. The canvases were included in more than 40 crates and were left untouched during the night under lock and key. Presumably, the shipment was gathered at sites in Europe, where priceless stores of paintings and art objects stolen by the Nazis from the countries they overran were discovered when Allied forces broke through into Germany and the dominated countries. The White House announced in Washington 2 months ago that shipments of art would be brought here for safekeeping, to be kept in trust for the rightful owners, and the National Gallery of Art, through its chairman, Chief Justice Harlan Fiske Stone, was asked to provide storage and protection for the works while they are in this country. The gallery is equipped with controlled ventilation and expert personnel for the storage and handling of such works. The White House announcement gave no listing of the paintings, but it is known that among the vast stores seized, including caches in Italy as well as Germany, and Hermann Goering's famous $200 million art collection, were included many of the world's art treasures and works of the masters. By coincidence, I received that same day a copy of the New York Times Overseas Weekly edition of December 9, which carried substantially the same story, except for the fact that it stated unequivocally that the paintings shipped to America were Nazi loot. Edith and I were gravely disturbed by the inaccuracy of the statements in these articles. Our concern was increased by the fact that the articles had appeared in so reliable a publication as the Times. What could have happened to the official press release on the subject, issued on the 24th of November when the James Parker was ready to sail? Open footnote. See in this connection the statements released to the press by the White House on September 26, 1945, and by the War Department on December 6, 1945. They are printed in Magazine of Art for February 1946. Close footnote. And why all the mystery? I reread the December 7 clipping. To me, there was the implication that we were shipping loot in wholesale lots to the United States. That would be alarming news to the countries whose stolen artworks we were already returning as rapidly as possible. The Times story most emphatically called for correction. But if a statement from our office were sent through channels, it probably wouldn't reach New York before Easter. Edith looked up from her work. There was a glint in her eye. She asked, "Will you do me a favor? I'd like to write the letter of correction." I told her to go ahead. 10 minutes later, she showed me the rough draft. It covered all the points. I reworked a phrase here and there, but made no important changes. As soon as it was typed and cleared, I signed and mailed it. As published in the New York Times 2 weeks later, on January 2, 1946, the letter read as follows. To the editor of the New York Times, on December 7, the Times printed a report to the effect that $80 million worth of paintings, presumably from the stores of art objects stolen by the Nazis, had arrived from Europe in the Army transport James Parker. Your Overseas Weekly edition of December 9 repeated this information, but stated categorically that the paintings were Nazi loot. It is true that the James Parker brought to America some 200 paintings of inestimable value, but none of them is loot or of dubious ownership. They are the property of the Kaiser Friedrich Museum in Berlin. A press release from the Office of Military Government for Germany, U.S., dated November 24, states that these priceless German-owned paintings, which might suffer irreparable damage if left in Germany through the winter, have been selected for temporary storage in the United States. These paintings have been gathered from various wartime repositories in the United States zone of Germany and are being shipped to Washington to ensure their safety and to hold them in trust for the people of Germany. The United States government has promised their return to the German people. It cannot be stated too emphatically that the policy of the American military government is to return all looted works of art to their owner nations with the greatest possible speed. Since the restitution in August of the famous Van Eyck altarpiece, The Mystic Lamb, to Belgium, a steady stream of paintings, sculpture, fine furniture, and other art objects poured from the highly organized collecting points of the United States zone to the liberated countries. Few, if any, looted works of art of any importance are of unknown origin, and though, among the vast masses of material taken from the Jews and other enemies of state for what was always described as safekeeping, there will undoubtedly be many pieces whose ownership will be difficult to determine. It appears unlikely that these will be found to be of great value. The shipment of German-owned paintings to the United States is thus a project entirely separate from the main objectives of the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives section of the Office of Military Government, namely the restitution of loot and the reestablishment of the German museums and other cultural organizations. To confuse this shipment, which was directed by the highest national authority, with what is now the routine work of preservation, identification, and restitution performed by trained specialist personnel, is to mislead our allies and to underrate the accomplishments of a small group of disinterested and hardworking Americans. Thomas C. Howe, Jr., Lieutenant Commander, USNR, Deputy Chief Director on leave, California Palace of the Legion of Honor, San Francisco, European Theater, December 18, 1945. The main objectives of the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives section of the American military government in Germany were defined in my letter to the New York Times as the restitution of loot and the reestablishment of the German museums and other cultural institutions. Honorable and constructive objectives, and, as expressed in that letter, unequivocal and reassuring both to the liberated countries of Europe and to the Germans. Yet how difficult of attainment, how difficult even to keep those objectives clearly in mind when confronted simultaneously, as our officers often were, with a dozen problems of equal urgency. At close range, it was impossible to look objectively at the overall record of our accomplishments, but homeward bound in February, I had that opportunity. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, and the picture took shape. It was possible to determine to what extent we have realized our objectives. So far as restitution is concerned, the record has been a success. During the summer months, our energies were devoted to obvious preliminary preparations. They included the establishment of central collecting points at Munich, Marburg, and Wiesbaden. Immediately thereafter, the contents of art repositories in the American zone were removed to those central depots. The central collecting points, organized and directed by monuments officers with museum experience, were staffed with trained personnel from German museums. The one at Munich was primarily reserved for looted art, since the majority of the cultural booty was found in Bavaria. The collecting points at Wiesbaden and Marburg, on the other hand, housed German-owned collections brought from repositories in which storage conditions were unsatisfactory. The process of actual restitution was inaugurated by token restitutions in the name of General Eisenhower to Belgium, Holland, France, and Czechoslovakia. Circumstances beyond our control postponed similar gestures of goodwill to Poland and Greece. Representatives of the liberated countries were invited to the American zone to identify and remove the loot from the collecting points. According to late reports, the restitution of loot was continuing without interruption. Shortly after my return, there were disquieting rumors of drastic reductions in American personnel connected with cultural restitution in Germany. I earnestly hoped that these rumors were without foundation. Such reductions would be disastrous to the completion of a program which has reflected so creditably on our government. The reestablishment of German museums and other cultural institutions, our second main objective, has been, to a large extent, sacrificed in the interests of restitution. This brings up again the urgent need for the immediate replenishment of our dwindling fine arts personnel in Germany. Our moral responsibility for the continuation of this phase of the MFA&A program is a grave one. It was understandably neglected during the first 6 months of our occupation in Germany, and it would be unfair to argue that the British have far outdistanced us in this field. That they have done so is undeniably true. However, the British found but little loot in their zone. Consequently, they have been able to make rapid strides in the reconstitution of German collections and cultural institutions, while we have been preoccupied with restitution. Notwithstanding that preoccupation, our monuments officers were instrumental in arranging a series of impressive exhibitions of German-owned masterpieces. The first of these was held at Marburg in November 1945. A second and more ambitious show, which included many of the fine treasures of the Bavarian State Galleries, opened at Munich in January 1946. A third, comprising paintings and sculptures from the museums of Berlin and Frankfurt, was presented at Wiesbaden in February. All these exhibitions were accompanied by catalogues with German and English texts. Those of Munich and Wiesbaden were lavishly illustrated. The Munich catalogue contained several plates showing the rooms in which the exhibition was held, lofty, spacious galleries recalling the marble halls of our own National Gallery at Washington. At the time of my departure from Germany, little was known of the French and Russian procedures with regard to cultural rehabilitation in their respective zones of occupation. Their military governments have made provisions for personnel capable of carrying on work similar to ours and that of the British. The caliber of the men drawn into the project from all branches of our armed forces has been cited as an important factor in the success of the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program. I would like to cite another factor which I consider equally important. There was no arbitrary drafting of personnel. Participation was voluntary. The resulting spontaneity and its value to the spirit of the work cannot be exaggerated. End of section 14. End of Salt Mines and Castles, The Discovery and Restitution of Looted European Art by Thomas Carr Howe.